Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Aizawa Forced Izuku and Bakugo to Room Together. The recommended playback speed for this video is 1.25x. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details, and go to the story link to say hi to the author. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku stepped into the A1 Alliance dorm building, crossing the entry in a hurried pace and hoping to steal past the common area unnoticed. He was glad he'd taken Ida up on his generous offer to train together for the past hour. But it was an hour that might have been better spent hitting the books instead. He had 3 days' worth of classes to catch up on, and he really needed to buckle down that night. He eyed Kirishima and Kaminari huddled together on the couch, Ashido peering over them as they shared a video. Not wanting to drown out the audio, Ashido and Kaminari were unsuccessfully fighting to hold back fits of laughter as they watched. Izuku couldn't help the faint smile that crossed him as he glimpsed the scene. Their laughter could be counted on filling the common room pretty much any given evening, and it was always a little contagious. He caught a whiff of something enticing wafting from the kitchen, and wasn't surprised to catch sight of Sato eating the sweet results of his labor at the table. Kirishima noticed him. "Hey, Midoriya," he waved, inviting him over. "You gotta come see this, man." Izuku's grin widened a fraction, despite regretting he'd have to take a rain check. He was grateful for the invitation, but he couldn't allow himself to be drawn into the typical evening shenanigans. He had too much studying to do. "Send me the link, will you?" Izuku responded, slowing a fraction. "Gotta get going on my catch-up work," he explained, offering a faint wave over his shoulder as he headed for the elevator. Kaminari snorted again before briefly pulling his gaze from the phone. "We're about to start studying here. Why don't you join us?" he asked. Izuku stepped up to the elevator. "Yeah, maybe I'll be back down in a bit," he offered, not wanting to outright decline. But he knew the kind of studying Kaminari was referring to was the kind that required quotation marks. aka they'd be continuing to laugh over YouTube videos for another hour or so before they even cracked a book. Again, Izuku was grateful for the invite, but he knew he wouldn't be productive if he attempted his homework in the common area. His house arrest had ended the day before, and while he was more than relieved to be back, the relief had been quickly drowned out by his anxiety over catching up. He'd made some decent progress the previous night, but he still had a ways to go. He briefly wondered how Kakin was faring. Today had been his first day back in class, and he'd seemed quieter than usual. Kakin usually functioned on 2 settings, quiet and evasive, or explosive and in your face. There wasn't much in between area with him. And while Izuku was more than familiar with both sides of his classmate, more so the explosive one, he could somehow tell it was a different sort of quiet Kakin had fallen into since their sparring match they'd caught hell for the other night. They'd exchanged accidental glances or brief snippets of uncharacteristically civil conversation when it couldn't be helped over the course of their house arrest. But mostly they'd tried to avoid each other. The night of their fight had been unexpected. Insane. Stupid. Horribly awkward. Izuku wasn't sure how to peg it exactly, and he still wasn't entirely certain how he felt about the whole thing, as he'd been trying to avoid dwelling on it too much. It only brought him anxiety, especially when an abnormally quiet Kakin had been the only other person lurking around the dorms during their arrest. How had Kakin pieced everything between All Might and him together? Well, honestly, he knew how Kakin was extremely smart and perceptive, and he'd probably been obsessively dwelling on Izuku's relatively new power ever since he'd first witnessed it. Izuku pretended not to notice, but he'd caught many a seething glare sent his way during classes and training the last several months. But yeah, of course Kakin would have figured out where his power came from. Izuku knew he was stupid for putting it past him. and he knew he was an idiot for hinting about it to Kaken in the first place. He shouldn't have done that. He should have listened to All Might. The idea that Kaken actually thought he was capable of pulling such a bogus move of lying to him for the last 10 years upset him. Both. Izuku would never attempt a ruse like that against his friend, let alone carry it out for over a decade. He still couldn't believe Kaken had actually thought he'd been hiding his quirk and laughing behind his back. It was absurd. It was borderline insulting. Was that why he had let his hint slip? Because of his own pride, meager as it may be? Regardless of why, ever since, a confrontation was inevitable. And when everything finally did come to a head, their confrontation ended up turning into a full-blown fight. Honestly, in a way, Izuku was sort of glad it had. They'd had so much pent-up animosity. That was maybe putting it lightly on Kaken's end. But yeah, lots of animosity between them. Finally addressing it had been oddly relieving. Despite how destructive the fight had been, and despite the consequences, and despite the fact that Kaken now knew. He knew everything. Izuku had been very wary of Kaken the past few days because of it. Wary of his quietness. Wary of feeling his eyes on him for brief moments when he thought Izuku didn't notice, weighing, judging, calculating. Izuku hadn't been able to get a feel for what might be going on in Kaken's head, and that was probably the reason for his added wariness. Kaken was usually very easy to read, angry avoid. But now his usual anger seemed almost dampened, in a way, like the sadness he'd unexpectedly and likely regretfully shown at ground beta still lingered. Seeing Kaken display actual emotion, other than fury, had been a little surreal. And a little painful. Proud Kaken capable of actually crying. No one would have believed him if he told them, which he never would. He couldn't help wanting to comfort his friend in some way, even though he knew Kaken would immediately cuss him out for even thinking about it. He knew Kaken would never accept his concern, and he probably didn't need it. But that didn't stop Izuku from wishing he wouldn't pick up on hints of distress every time Kaken entered his field of vision lately. Still though, a small part of Izuku had to admit he was a little glad someone else shared his and All Might's secret. Even if it was Kaken. It seemed to have lessened the burden, as strange as that may seem. Again, even if it was Kaken. There was now a faint feeling of knowing when their eyes accidentally met for brief moments. And something about that was almost a little comforting in a weird way. Even it was Kaken. Izuku snapped out of his thoughts upon approaching his room. Mainta was sticking his head out the door down the hall. "What'd you do now, Midoriya?" Mainta demanded, snickering. "Huh?" Izuku asked, confused. He stepped up to his door, noticing a note taped to it. "See me after dinner. Aizawa." What was this? Izuku swallowed dryly, wondering what more Aizawa might have to say to him. He couldn't recall doing anything wrong since completing his house arrest sentence. Izuku pulled out his phone, glancing at the time. He hadn't eaten yet, but technically it could be considered after dinner. "Well?" Mainta pressed, smirking. "Yeah, I'm not sure," Izuku replied, pulling the note off as he entered his room. He figured he may as well grab his backpack in case he arrived earlier than expected and had some time to kill waiting. What could Mr. Aizawa want? Biting his lip, he slung his bag over his shoulder and headed for his teacher's quarters. 5 minutes earlier. Bakugo huffed as he stepped off the elevator and onto the 4th floor. That had been annoying as hell. Why can't anyone in this damn place take no for an answer? No, he didn't want to see their lame-ass video. No, he didn't want to head up a study session. He had too much shit to do on his own. No, he didn't want to try any of Big Lip's tooth-rotting garbage shit. Yes, everything was fine. What the hell did they care anyway? He just needed to get away. Got him. He huffed again, heading down the hall to his room. What the hell? There was a note taped to his door. "See me after dinner. Aizawa." Ah, got him it. What now? He didn't have time for this shit. He had 4 days' worth of work to catch up on, and the last thing he needed was a nosy teacher getting on his case again. He'd complied with all the terms of his house arrest. He'd even managed not to blow up shitty Deku, while they'd been holed up together cleaning up everyone else's shit. What more could Aizawa want from him? He ripped the note off and made to enter his room. What the EFF? Why was his door locked? He rattled the handle again. Locked. He never kept a key on him. No one really locked their doors in the dorms. He immediately flushed, his shoulders tightening as he willed himself not to blow the handle off the door. Which little effer's idea of a joke was this? That piece of shit grapes for balls. He'd kill him. But why would that little douchebag have been on the 4th floor? Was this shitty hair's way of making sure Bakugo had no choice but to join their lame-ass study group that evening? No, shitty hair was smarter than that, and usually more respectful. Kirishima had a pretty good read on his moods, and Bakugo knew he wouldn't have pressed him that night. He glanced down the hall. Was it Arms? No, he and Arms had only interacted a handful of times, and Arms was actually one of the few people there that wasn't straight up annoying as all EFF. Bakugo forced the tension in his shoulders to lessen somewhat. He'd find out who'd locked his room from the inside, and he'd enjoy blowing their face off before they even had a chance to smirk about it. Later, though, he sighed, turning around and heading back to the elevator. First, he had to see what Nosy wanted. Bakugo stepped into Aizawa's office and was instructed to have a seat and wait. Aizawa disappeared back through the door connecting his bedroom, cack-eyed, the 2 chairs facing the desk. He couldn't help fuming slightly at the sight, hoping that was their usual arrangement, and there wasn't a particular reason why 2 chairs had been pulled up instead of 1. He took a seat just as there was a knock at the door accompanied by a "Mr. Aizawa," in the last voice Bakugo wanted to hear at the moment. "Effing hell," Bakugo said under his breath, closing his eyes briefly to keep from fuming too much. He was in his teacher's office. He had to keep it together. Aizawa reappeared, moving to answer the office door. "Come in, Midoriya. Sit down," Aizawa instructed in his usual even tone, stepping around behind his desk to face them. Bakugo didn't turn to look at Deku, but he could practically feel how the damn nerd nearly jumped at noticing his presence. He wanted to shake his head at the idiot's hesitation. Why the hell had he been acting even more scared of Bakugo lately, after their throwdown had nearly ended in a draw? It had nearly ended in an effing draw. Bakugo found himself clenching his teeth, still hardly able to believe it. He pushed it from his mind, knowing it wouldn't be a good idea to dwell on it just then. Deku slowly entered the room and reluctantly took the seat next to him. Bakugo fumed again. "Hurry it up, asshat. I don't have all night." "So," Aizawa began, addressing them both. Bakugo stared at the desk. He didn't feel like making eye contact with anyone at the moment. Least of all his teacher, whom he knew was just about to scold them again. Why, he wasn't sure. He hadn't done anything wrong during their house arrest, and he didn't think Deku had either. "Did you boys manage to resolve things during your time under house arrest?" HM. He felt Deku glance at him briefly, but made no move to acknowledge him. "Huh?" Deku responded upon seeing Bakugo was leaving this shit up to him. What do you mean, Mr. Aizawa?" Eloquent as ever. Bakugo rolled his eyes. "I mean," Aizawa responded, looking to Deku. "Did you discuss it at all? Come to terms with each other? Agree to move past it with a newfound mutual respect and understanding of one another? Gain any semblance of the sorely lacking sense you both are very much in need of?" "Ooh." Bakugo let out an exasperated huff at Deku's uselessness. "Right, I didn't think so," Aizawa said, stifling an annoyed sigh. Bakugo shifted slightly in his seat, knowing whatever came next wasn't going to be good. "So here's what's going to happen," Aizawa began, and Bakugo couldn't help raising his gaze to him. He just knew some shit like this was about to go down. You both know how irate the ground beta incident made me. You're too old for this kind of crap, and frankly, so am I. He inhaled, a hint of his usual fatigue present. And the thing is, I'm absolutely certain a repeat of said incident is just around the corner. And another one around the next corner, and so on, he continued. Bakugo and Deku couldn't help leaning forward a touch, all dread. They both clearly wanted to refute him, to beg him not to go on. But they were smart and remained silent. We're going to put an end to this now, before it has a chance to continue festering and grow even worse. Until you can convince me otherwise that the self-destructive rivalry has been tempered. That the urge to one-up and knock down and completely best each other at every possible turn has faded. He paused, gathering a breath. Until you can convince me that you're actual friends and not enemies because contrary to popular belief, that's what you two are. I'm not putting up with this in-between nonsense anymore. The two of you have to figure out how to be friends if you're going to continue making any headway in this program and the heroing career in general. He drew another tired breath, sounding slightly more resigned. Or at the very least, you have to learn how to tolerate each other and work together effectively. He paused briefly, reflective. You two could be such a force to be reckoned with if only you were legitimately on the same side. Mr. Aizawa, Deku began, his voice bordering on panic. Bakugo shot him a fiery glare. He was the one who had the right to panic, not shitty Deku. You can't really, some people just can't be forced to be friends. Shut up, Deku. Bakugo knew Deku was excluding himself from that statement and putting all the blame on him. What the hell did he know? I think you'd be surprised. If two people as polar opposite as present Mike and I were able to figure out how to tolerate and actually even somewhat like each other, then I'm sure you two can't, too. It's not that hard. That was pretty rich coming from Mr. The World Can Leave Me the Hell Alone Aizawa. Aizawa paused briefly. In this field, you're going to be forced to work with and befriend all different types, some of whom you legitimately won't like. Now's the time to grow up and learn how to properly socialize. What? Properly socialize? That wasn't even an issue. This was such bullshit. They both had made friends in the program. Yeah, maybe Deku more so. Every one of those idiots liked Deku for some unfathomable reason. But who the hell cared? Why did he feel like Aizawa was directing this all at him? Aizawa was still going. Bakugo, I know this is mostly one-sided. Like hell it was. That's why you'll be the one to move into Midoriya's room. Wait, what? Had he just heard him right? Starting tonight, you two are going to be rooming together, eating together, training together, studying together, doing literally everything together until you figure out a way to tolerate each other. Bakugo was trying hard not to shake as much as he was. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. What? Deku sounded breathless with fear. Mr. Aizawa kill each other. Bakugo threw Deku a sidelong glare. Each other? No, I'll kill you, shitty nerd. Shut the hell up. Then you'll save me the trouble of having to expel you both. Aizawa responded dryly. I've asked Ida to help keep an eye on you. If he doesn't think you two are complying enough, or not enough progress is being made, further measures will be taken. Don't make me request the board to get a therapist involved, because that would be very annoying, and quite embarrassing on your part. Bakugo was just staring, mouth slightly agape. Was he actually hearing this? Bakugo, you'll have access to your room for the next 2 hours to move your belongings. After that, your room will remain closed. I'll have staff members bring in another bed, desk and wardrobe later this evening, so don't worry about moving furniture. Bakugo could only continue to stare. At least he was no longer shaking, frozen solid as he was. Mr. Aizawa, Deku had broken out of his own stupor long enough to attempt negotiating. Please, this really isn't a good idea. I didn't ask your opinion, Midoriya, Aizawa responded, shutting him down. I told you what's expected of you both, And if you can't meet such simple parameters of learning to tolerate each other, and ceasing to be such a distraction to the rest of the class, then I have serious doubts this is the correct program for either of you. Deku opened his mouth again, but no words came. Bakugo just sat there, completely awash with disbelief. Go. You're dismissed, Aizawa said, standing. He was about to turn away before deciding to add, take this seriously. Don't let your personal childhood prejudices prevent you from learning and growing from this. It took effort, but Bakugo finally forced himself to his feet, his movements stiff and halting. He could feel Deku's eyes on him as he stood, but he refused to meet them. He didn't say anything. He had no words. He turned on his heel, fists clenched tight to hide any sparks, and left the room. Izuku made his way back to his bedroom in a bit of a daze. He could hardly believe what had just gone down in Mr. Aizawa's office. He and Kaken were going to be forced to be roommates. Was Mr. Aizawa out of his mind? Did he have some sort of death wish for Izuku? Had their sneaking out the other night really been such an offensive disregard of the rules as to warrant a death sentence? Because Izuku was pretty certain his death was the only foreseeable outcome to the conditions Mr. Aizawa had laid out. Kaken would kill him within the first night. He knew Kaken's outrage over this whole thing would be unrelenting, especially seeing how Kaken was still trying to come to terms with his most recent resentment towards Izuku, his realization that Izuku had caught up to his skill level, and his confirmation of Izuku's connection to All Might. How was Izuku supposed to deal with a Kaken who was still processing all that? Kaken's spiteful words from the other night suddenly came to the forefront of Izuku's mind, despite his repeated attempts to keep them at bay. I'll go higher than even you, Chosen One. Izuku inwardly winced. Chosen One, really? He knew Kaken had mostly thrown it out as a sarcastic dig at him, but he also knew it was likely that Kaken was really going to view him as such from then on, sarcasm aside or not. It was not a comfortable thought. Izuku would never consider himself a chosen one of any sort. Not at any point in his life. Not even when he'd received All Might's powers. The idea almost made him scoff. Contrary to what Kaken might think, Izuku had worked extremely hard to get to where he was, and he certainly didn't think he was in any way better than Kaken, or anyone else for that matter, as the inheritor of All Might's powers. But regardless of whether or not he really was some kind of chosen one in Kaken's eyes, the resentment was real, and Kaken had promised to up his game even further because of everything he'd learned. And Izuku knew it was imperative that he keep right up with him. The thing was, though, Izuku was hoping their competing could continue at as much of a distance from each other as possible. He was hoping to have at least a couple weeks of minimal to no interaction with Kaken for things to cool down after the night at Ground Beta. But here they were, being forced to face each other again. Being forced to address everything that had happened. Izuku knew it would have to be addressed. And he also knew Kaken would not be agreeable to the idea. He knew exactly how things would go down. He would tentatively attempt to engage Kaken in a civil conversation, and Kaken would immediately shut him down with a few choice words. Well, hopefully he only used words. If things got physical again. Izuku shuddered at the prospect, a fleeting glimpse of Mr. Aizawa's livid face crossing his mind. But if they were seriously going to be forced to live together, Izuku couldn't stand the thought of still having so many ignored, unsaid things between them. Kaken's resentment and dislike would only continue to build further, if that were possible, and Izuku hated to think of what would happen the next time things came to a head. The confrontation at Ground Beta had been a small start of sorts. There was still such a long ways to go, though. Izuku vaguely wondered if progress between the two of them was something that would even be feasible. He knew he wasn't kidding himself by admitting he and Kaken could never actually be friends again. Their relationship was too far gone. There was too much hurt and too much hate on his end, hate on Kaken's. And it wasn't that he couldn't forgive Kaken, he could. Fairly easily, too. But he knew Kaken would never ask for nor want his forgiveness. the idea would only infuriate him. Izuku truly believed Kaken was incapable of seeing all the wrong he'd done over the years. He knew Kaken was smart and observant, but his all-encompassing pride inhibited a lot of his perception. And how could anyone feel remorse for wrongs committed blindly? With the possibility of friendship off the table, maybe they could at least fix things to the point where Kaken wouldn't want to murder Izuku anytime he laid eyes on him. That would definitely be a step forward. As much as he hated admitting it though, Aizawa was right, in a way. His and Kaken's animosity was too much of a distraction. A destructive one. And as much as Izuku wanted to brush off the blame and chalk it up to Kaken just being an impossible person who couldn't stand him, he knew he was going to have to shoulder a bulk of the responsibility of fixing things. More perhaps, since he was the one that actually cared. He sighed. As much as this was going to suck, Izuku was still going to try. Because that's what he did. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge. And he wasn't nearly as afraid of Kaken as he used to be. They were actually evenly matched now. Izuku couldn't help the smallest spark of pride that suddenly came to light inside him at that thought. He was actually capable of holding his own against the boy who had so relentlessly tormented him growing up, who had looked down on him so completely. Izuku had come so far, and no one, not even Kaken, was going to stop him on his path to becoming the next #1 hero. Even if he was forced to face him literally every hour of every day. He could do this. He could. Izuku snapped back to the present. He'd arrived at his room, and he hadn't noticed Mainta was peeking out his door again, talking to him. Well? Huh? Izuku asked, having missed his question. What was that all about? Mainta repeated impatiently. Izuku wasn't sure how to reply. He didn't want to completely brush Mainta off, but he also didn't want to voice the prospect of Kaken moving in with him, because that would just make it all that much more real, and he wanted to stay in denial over it for at least the next hour. Aizawa just needed to talk to us. Izuku trailed off vaguely, opening his door and disappearing inside before Mainta could grill him further. Us? He heard Mainta question down the hall. He didn't have as much beef with Mainta as most of their class did. But yeah, he supposed the guy could be a little nosy. Izuku dropped his backpack with a disheartened sigh. And he'd thought things had been looking up since his house arrest had ended. Kaken had been so much less confrontational than usual. He'd somehow caught the attention of the head of US Big Three, and he'd felt such a renewed sense of determination and confidence, almost. And no, he was just feeling all around crappy. Life with Kaken was not going to be fun, to put it bluntly. But Izuku could hold his own now. He'd proven that. And Kaken had actually acknowledged it. He'd have to remind himself of it again and again. He shouldn't be as scared as he was. He shouldn't be as filled with dread as he was. 2 hours. He had close to 2 remaining hours of a relatively happy life to take advantage of. He knew Kaken would push the move off as close to the time limit as possible. And that was fine with Izuku. He glanced around the room. He really needed to start studying, but he supposed it might be helpful to get going on rearranging some of the furniture. Izuku swiped up handfuls of All Might action figures, tossing them in a box in his closet. He pulled his lamp's cord from the wall and started maneuvering his desk under the window. Kaken's could form a corner with it, while leaving enough room for a second bed along the wall opposite his. Shoulders drooped, Izuku tried to stifle another sigh. This just sucked. He'd loved living on campus. He'd loved his room. The peace and quiet of it. Despite the brightly colored All Might memorabilia. That was what he liked most about it, actually. It had been a haven of sorts that had made him really happy the last several weeks. And now it was going to be a prison of sorts. A cell he'd share with the one person who hated him most in the world. He sighed again, and he didn't sniff just then, and bent to gather his backpack. Dejected, he made his way to his desk and pulled out his homework. It was only a few minutes later when a polite knock sounded at his door. It definitely wasn't a Kaken knock. Luckily, he got up to open it. 2 maintenance staff members greeted him, carrying a bed frame between them. Izuku motioned them in, trying to come across more courteous than he felt at the moment. They entered the room and lowered the frame to the space Izuku had cleared. It was small, only a twin size, when the rest of the students were full. Izuku suspected they'd borrowed furniture from one of the unoccupied dorm rooms the school had furnished as potential guest rooms if ever needed. The workers disappeared and came back several minutes later with a mattress, and then again with a small desk and dresser. Izuku's heart grew a little heavier each time they returned with something new in tow. The next addition to his former safe haven would be Kaken himself. Izuku stared at his homework, wondering why it briefly looked a little blurry. He was finding it difficult to concentrate. He had been so optimistic about getting all caught up that night. But of course all this had to happen instead. Ugh. Focus. Stay on task. None of this really mattered when there was work be done. It didn't matter if Kaken was potentially going to blow his door away at any moment. Just concentrate. The minutes ticked by and Izuku's nerves only became more and more on edge. It was making studying impossible. He almost wished Kaken would just show up already and put an end to his tense apprehension. He sighed, half-heartedly tossing his pencil against the notebook. He leaned back, stretching his cramped muscles. There was a knock at the door, and it actually didn't sound quite as hostile as Izuku was expecting. That didn't stop his stomach from completely dropping, though. He turned in his chair. "Come in," Izuku said, wishing his voice sounded a whole lot steadier than it did. The door opened, and there was Kaken arms full of a large stack of clothes, face wrought with a look that just dared anyone to make eye contact with him. Why was it suddenly so hard for Izuku to swallow? "Hey," he said, halfway drawing to his feet. Kaken continued to glower at him from the doorway for what felt like way longer than the brief moment it was, and finally stepped inside, ignoring Izuku as he pulled his eyes away and turned towards the extra dresser. Wordlessly, he began piling his clothes in the drawers. Izuku stood, all hesitation. "Do you need any help? With the rest of your things, I mean?" Kaken stopped for a moment, shoulders tight. Izuku could hear his sharp breathing across the room. He stood there unmoving, before turning to lock crimson eyes with Izuku once more. "No." As brief of an answer as it was, it certainly wasn't lacking in seething vehemence. Izuku willed himself not to stutter in response. "Okay," he said, surprisingly close to evenly. "I'm just gonna get back to my homework, then." He turned his back to Kaken and sat back down, retrieving his pencil and hoping he might actually find some focus now that the dreaded moment had officially passed. Kaken quietly resumed his task behind him, opening and closing drawers, and silently leaving at intervals, going back and forth between the 4th floor. The closet opened several times between his reappearances, and then eventually the bathroom. Finally, the move apparently complete, Kaken drew up next to Izuku, dropping his books on the smaller desk with a thud. He wasn't gentle as he pulled the chair out to take a seat. Izuku glanced at him from the corner of his eye, a little relieved and a little wary at Kaken's continued silence. It was like ground beta had really messed with him, or something. He was so difficult to get a read on lately. But as long as he was intent on getting right to his homework without interruption, Izuku was fine with that. He turned his attention back to his book. They worked next to each other for a good 15 to 20 minutes, neither speaking or even glancing at each other. Every so often, though, Izuku would notice Kaken's pencil immediately stop, his shoulders drawing in, tightening. Izuku eyed him nervously out of the corner of his eye every time that happened, but mostly he pretended not to notice. It occurred at frequent intervals, perhaps every 5 to 10 minutes, and Izuku could swear Kaken's shoulders had started to shake the last time he'd paused. Izuku hesitated briefly before going back to work, his own pencil more tentative than before. It was about another 5 minutes later that Kakin finally snapped. He suddenly drew to his feet with an angry growl, grabbing at the nearest All Might poster on the wall. He tore it down, ripping at a piece of tape that had held it in place, and rounded on Izuku, shoving it squarely against his mouth. It happened so fast, Izuku could barely blink, and he failed to hold back the muffled gasp of alarm that escaped him. "Shut up," Kakin yelled in his face. Thoroughly startled, Izuku raised a hand to his face, aiming to free his mouth as quickly as it had been obstructed. He felt immediately indignant at the tape's uncalled-for intrusion. Why had Kakin done that? Kakin noticed him reaching for the tape and immediately snagged his wrist in a vice-like grip. "Don't you dare take that off, Deku," Kakin warned, his voice low and dangerous. Well, so much for Kakin's perplexing silent treatment. This was more like the Kakin Izuku knew, although that didn't make the situation any less maddening. Izuku reached up with his other hand, and again, Kakin instantly seized it in an unyielding grip. "Did you hear what I said?" Izuku let a muffled protest escape him and flushed in anger and embarrassment. What was Kakin's problem? He hadn't even done anything. He tried to tug his wrists free, but Kakin's grip was painfully solid. "Did you hear me?" Kakin demanded again as Izuku attempted twisting towards his thumbs to break free. There was no give. "Did you? Stop fighting, you goddamn piece of shit." Izuku started getting a little frantic, because honestly, Kakin was scaring him a little. He pushed back as far as his chair allowed, hoping to pull free, but it just wasn't happening. He wasn't sure if he made the conscious decision or not. But before he even realized what he was doing, his arms were alight with One for All. He just needed a little strength to free himself from Kakin's grasp. Kakin noticed and immediately released him, causing Izuku to fall backwards and crash to the floor with a loud clatter, his shout of alarm hindered by the tape. Kakin was straight away in battle stance, palms flipped upward and sparking. A dangerous grin stole across his face. "Is that how you want to play this, Deku?" Izuku rolled to his back and immediately ripped the tape off his mouth. "Kakin," he demanded, drawing his elbows under him. He was vaguely surprised it was indignant anger he was addressing Kakin with, not fear. "Stop. What's your problem?" He had let go of One for All as soon as Kakin had released him. Kakin didn't relax his stance. His palms continued sparking. "Come on, you little shit, you wanna go?" "No, calm down, geez," Izuku replied, pushing himself to his seat and rubbing the back of his head. "What the heck did I even do to you?" As vulnerable as he was on the ground, and with One for All released, Izuku was fairly certain any threats of a fight wouldn't amount to much. Kakin wouldn't attack him at a disadvantage like that. Not in the dorms. Not when they were already in trouble. Kakin's palms stopped sparking, but he didn't exactly relax his stance. "You wouldn't?" "Shut up. God, just shut up. I wasn't even saying anything. You were mumbling, you goddamn moron. Always the goddamn mumbling." Izuku blinked. Had he been mumbling as he was studying? He hadn't even noticed. "I didn't realize," Izuku admitted, a little embarrassed. "But geez, all you had to do was ask me to stop." "TCH," Kakin spat, flinging his chair back in place before plopping back down in it. "Why don't you just keep your goddamn mouth shut and save me the trouble, asshole?" Izuku hung his head a moment, exasperated. Could there have possibly been a more demonstrative preview of what life with Kakin was going to be like? He sighed. Kakin shot him a glare. "The hell's your problem?" "Nothing," Izuku responded, stifling another sigh. Kakin huffed again before returning to his homework, and Izuku righted his chair, pulling it back into place and straightening the books that had been knocked askew during the ruckus. He attempted to get back to his work, his head stinging mildly, and his pride a little wounded. It wasn't a couple minutes later that there was a knock at the door. "Midoriya?" It was Kirishima's voice. They both glanced over their shoulder, and Izuku stood to answer. Kaken went back to his homework, glaring. He likely knew the timing of the visit was no coincidence. Izuku drew the door open, revealing Todoroki and a concerned-looking Kirishima. The two had become fairly decent friends since Kamino Ward, likely to the dismay of Kaken. He never acted possessive over Kirishima, preferring to pretend the redhead actually didn't mean much to him. But Izuku suspected Kaken hated that Todoroki attempted friendliness with his best friend. It was actually kind of ironic that it was the mutual desire to rescue Kaken that brought them together in the first place. "Can we come in?" Kirishima asked, as Izuku gestured them in. A quick glance across the room saw Kaken's shoulders tightening again as he stayed hunched over his homework. "Is everything all right in here?" Todoroki asked, getting right to the point as he crossed the threshold. "Yeah," Izuku responded, playing off the question as if he didn't understand why they were asking. "We heard a commotion from downstairs," Todoroki continued, eyeing Kaken with the faintest trace of accusation etched amongst the stoicism. Kaken suddenly whirled around, slamming his pencil against his notebook. "Why don't you mind your own goddamn business, half and half?" "Hey, Bakugo," Kirishima waved cheerfully, approaching him and claiming Izuku's seat for a moment. "What do you want, shitty hair?" "Ida filled us in on this whole part 2 of your guy's punishment," Kirishima explained, a hint of condolences behind his voice. "Yeah, it sucks ass. What the hell do you care?" "Aizawa's a bit of a hard ass, isn't he?" Kirishima smirked, having maybe just a little fun with Kaken's flustered state. "Stop talking to me." "Although, gotta admit," Kirishima went on, still grinning, Izuku admired the heck out of the guy for never being the least bit intimidated by Kaken. Midori is definitely the one getting the worse end of the deal here. Being stuck with you for who knows how long, man. "What the hell do you know? You got him, idiot. Why are you even here?" Kirishima laughed. Todoroki was briefly studying Izuku, looking for any obvious signs of abuse. Izuku avoided his gaze, pretending not to notice. He was grateful to his friends for being willing to look out for him, but he kind of wished they wouldn't. He feared it would only draw further resentment from Kaken. And plus, he could handle his own now. They'd already had their first physical altercation, and Izuku had survived just fine. He could do this. Todoroki conversed quietly with Izuku for a bit, while Kirishima went back to poking the proverbial bear with a stick. He kept at it until Kaken finally snapped. "How the hell am I supposed to get any of my fucking work done when all you stupid fuckers won't leave me the fuck alone? Get out." Kirishima snickered on his way out, his work done there for the evening. Before leaving, Todoroki gave Izuku what only he could interpret as an encouraging nod. Anyone else would have just called it a barely noticeable inclination of the head. An hour passed in relative and productive peace, before Kaken finally put his pencil down and stood, disappearing into the bathroom. And upon re-emerging 10 minutes later, he made his way straight to Izuku's desk and flipped off his lamp. "Hey, I'm not done yet." "Yeah, you are. I'm not going to sleep later than 10:30. Izuku stood with a resigned sigh, figuring it was no use. He may as well get ready and go to bed. Kaken whipped back around to face him once more, and Izuku nearly bumped into him. Kaken stuck a harsh finger in his chest. "Stop with the goddamn sighing." Izuku raised his hands defensively. "All right, geez. And stop saying geez every 2 seconds like a little bitch." Izuku fumed faintly. "Okay, Kaken, any other requests, your worship?" Had he seriously just mouthed off to Kaken? What was he thinking? Kaken glared. "Yeah, don't get smart, you piece of shit. And keep your goddamn mouth shut. I swear to God, if I wake up to any mumbling tonight." Izuku was a little glad he didn't finish that threat. He made his way to the bathroom and got ready, trying to keep his thoughts from reeling as much as they were. He climbed into bed a short time later, yawning and needing his pillow. He rolled to his side. He pushed the blanket off him a fraction too hot, then pulled it back as a draft snuck in. Unsatisfied, he rolled to his other side. Stop moving. Izuku tried to still himself, but it was no good. He could never fall asleep without going through his usual 15-minute adjustment period. A moment later, he flipped his pillow over and rolled to his stomach. It was still no good. He rolled to his back once more, arms drawing up to cradle his head. Hey, shithead. If you don't stop moving, I swear to God I'll tie you down to that bed so tight you can't even breathe. Izuku didn't reply. But luckily, he was comfy enough to finally stay still. Kaken, Izuku spoke a moment later, sleep inching its way around his eyes. I'm not gonna let you hold me back, he stated through a poorly stifled yawn. Kaken was silent for a moment, and Izuku wasn't expecting a reply. Great. Now shut up the hell up and go to sleep. Another long moment passed. Andy don't want to hold you back either. Sleep was more threatening now, dulling his thoughts and speech. Another yawn. I'm sorry about all this. Go to sleep, shitty Deku. Bakugo woke early, blinking his eyes open and squinting at the unfamiliar setting. A faint pre-dawn glow took on a purplish hue as it filtered through red and blue curtains. Oh, right. Deku's room. Got him it. He sat up stretching, not feeling quite as well rested in his new, crappy twin-size bed. It was shit, and it sucked. But whatever. It was just another crappy aspect of this infuriating punishment Aizawa thought he couldn't hack. He'd show him, though. He wouldn't say shit about any of it. He definitely didn't want to. But he let his gaze fall to Deku across the room. Well, at least where shitty Deku should have been. His bed was empty. And already made. Bakugo immediately fumed, taking it as an obvious dig against him. That piece of shit. Deku had the gall to get up and get going without so much as disturbing him. Did Deku really think he was that much better than him? What, 5:30 wasn't early enough? Deku really thought starting half an hour earlier would give him that much of an edge over Bakugo. Screw him. Bakugo would set his alarm for 4:30 the next day, and he'd show that goddamn nerd what it meant to get up and get going early. That shithead. He drew his covers aside and immediately made for his dresser, grabbing some workout clothes and throwing them on. Still fuming, he left the room already practically at a jog, making his way downstairs and out across the grounds. He ran to the main building and headed for the gym. If he bumped into shitty Deku there, he'd give him a piece of his mind. He'd tell that stupid nerd off for letting him sleep longer than him. Got him. His blood was still boiling as he entered the training gym. There was a handful of other kids there in the gym nearest his homeroom, but luckily not a tuft of green hair met his sight. They were just a bunch of extras. Bakugo was still seething as he set to training. He couldn't decide if he was relieved or disappointed not to find Deku there. Yeah, it was nice to have a break from the annoying little shit for once. But it might have been nicer to have had the chance to stomp ass on him that morning instead. It was actually better he wasn't there, he concluded. If he felt goaded to the point of seriously physically clashing with Deku again, he'd catch hell. Even more hell than they'd already caught. It wouldn't be worth it. Still, he was surprised Deku had the nerve to ignore Aizawa's instructions about them training together. He'd thought for sure the stupid nerd would be trailing him all morning. But maybe Deku thought beating Bakugo awake gave him a loophole out of Aizawa's rules. That asshole. Bakugo was surprised. He actually felt somewhat disappointed about training alone. Again, not because he wanted that idiot's company, by any means. But it would have been advantageous to keep an eye on what Deku was currently working on. Bakugo would be an idiot not to admit Deku's progress had been consistent and inordinately fast. And now it finally made sense why. The little shit was the new inheritor of All Might's powers. One for all. Bakugo still could hardly believe it was true. He'd suspected. He'd has his theories. But to have had them all confirmed straight from All Might's mouth the other night, it just… Bakugo heard a shout of alarm nearby. "Watch it. First year," one of the extras yelled at him. He hadn't realized he'd lost a little bit of control over his explosions, as his thoughts had been getting away from him. "Watch yourself, asshole," he snarled back. "Got him it." Bakugo couldn't let his anger get away from him like that. Deku was strong now, and fast, and getting stronger and faster every day. As infuriating as it was, he had to admit it to himself. Staying in denial would only give Deku more of an edge over him, would only cause him to be taken by surprise again and again at his constant improvement. Got him it. Of all the people All Might could have chosen, why? Why did it have to be Deku? Why was Bakugo cursed to never be rid of that stupid nerd in his shadow? That stupid, idiot nerd who always thought he was so much better. Who could never be taught his place, no matter how hard Bakugo tried. Who was actually now capable of pulling free from Bakugo's shadow, despite how hard Bakugo tried to keep him there. Why? "Hey, Firsty." The extra seemed angrier now. "Are you trying to kill us, you idiot? Why don't you take a little break and get a hold of your quirk, you noob? What did you say to me?" After jogging around the campus to cool down from his heated training session, Bakugo decided he'd better start getting ready for class. Ugh. And that meant going back to Deku's room. The morning had been nothing but aggravating already, and now Bakugo was going to be forced to face the source of his aggravation once again. How in the hell was he supposed to survive this punishment? And how in the hell was Deku supposed to survive it, for that matter? Bakugo knew it was only a matter of time before he likely killed him. But he knew that was all part of Aizawa's testing him. He had to prove he could keep enough of a handle on his temper. He'd be out if he couldn't. All because of Deku. It always came down to shitty Deku. He tried his best to contain a growl as he flung their dorm room door open. Deku was sitting at his desk, hair damp, and already dressed in his uniform. He offered a half-hearted glance over his shoulder in greeting. "Hey," he said, distracted, turning right back to his homework. The idiot had already trained, showered, gotten ready, and now had more time for his studies than Bakugo would. Bakugo tried to swallow another growl. "Nice to see you're taking Aizawa seriously, asshole." "Huh?" Deku glanced over at him. Bakugo threw a drawer open, gathering clean underwear and socks. "What, you thought you'd be all careful about not waking me this morning? Just so I wouldn't kick your ass in training?" He didn't turn to face Deku, but he could practically feel how the nerd's brow furrowed at that. "Ya wanted to train together this morning?" Deku responded, confused. "I don't want to do anything with you, shit for brains." Bakugo turned to glare at him, infuriated by Deku's unfailing tendency of always missing the goddamn point. "I'm just saying, if you think you can get an edge on me by sneaking out and starting earlier than me, you've got another thing coming, asshole." Deku's brows pinched even closer. "And if that idiot Four Eyes narks on us to Aizawa, all because you're a goddamn chicken shit wuss, I'll beat the crap out of you." Bakugo could practically feel the idiot's wide eyes boring into him as he turned, flinging the closet open. "Kakin, I just didn't want to wake you," Deku explained, a hint of confusion still lining his voice. "That's all. I wasn't looking for an advantage by getting up earlier." He paused a moment. "And if I had woken you before your alarm, you would have lashed out at me anyway." Bakugo turned to lock eyes with him. Those stupid, big green eyes, always full of bewilderment. Because Deku was an idiot. "Lashed out?" Bakugo repeated him, his voice dangerous. "I don't lash out, you goddamn moron. What am I, 6? "Well," Deku replied a little hesitantly. "What are you doing right now, then?" Bakugo took a threatening step towards him. "I'm about to punch your goddamn face in, for one thing." Did Deku just stifle a snicker? He'd turned back to his work, so Bakugo couldn't tell for certain. Oh, he'd punch his teeth in for sure if he was laughing. "Okay," Deku said, tapping his notebook with his pencil as he scanned for where he'd left off. Punching faces in is not lashing out. Duly noted. Bakugo was across the room in a split second, gripping Deku's uniform tightly as he pulled him halfway out of his chair. He couldn't help winding up his other arm. He wanted to deck one of those stupid green eyes so bad. Do you want to die, you piece of shit? What did I tell you about being a smartass? No Kaken. Deku raised his hands defensively, but not enough to show he was game for a fight. Just stop. I wasn't trying to provoke you at all this morning. I don't know why you're even madder than usual at me. Kaken drew his arm back a touch further, the urge to punch him overwhelming. And if you hit me right before class, pretty sure Aizawa, or at least Ida, will notice and bust us both. You could always just say it happened during training. All Bakugo had to do was let his arm fly, and the nerd would shut up. Except I was just talking with Ida a few minutes ago, so he'd probably know it's a lie. Deku raised his brows a touch, hoping it was enough to diffuse the situation. Bakugo just sat there a moment, glowering. You're one annoying son of a bitch, you know that? Bakugo said, lowering his arm and releasing Deku roughly. Deku just adjusted his uniform and wisely chose to remain quiet. He picked up his pencil again and got right back to work. Bakugo just glared at him. Why was it always so impossible to provoke the stupid nerd? He was such a pushover wuss. TCH, Bakugo spat out, turning for the bathroom and thinking how the nerd had better have cleared out of their room by the time he was done if he knew what was good for him. After getting ready and stopping by the dining hall for a quick breakfast, Bakugo was still one of the first students to arrive at the classroom. He preferred to be early. It was easier to ignore the commotion when he didn't have to fight his way through it. He crossed through the tall door, etched with the giant WANA lettering, and stepped inside, his stomach immediately seizing in anger. His desk had been pulled back to line up side by side with Deku's. Bakugo knew. He shouldn't be surprised, really. It was like Kirishima had said the night before Aizawa was a hard-ass. Bakugo swallowed his rage and crossed the room, claiming the desk on the Windows side. He could feel eyes on him. He dropped his bag, looking up to find the half-and-half bastard watching him with what Bakugo assumed was the beginning hints of a smirk. The hell are you looking at? You got something to say to me, icy hot? Half-and-half blinked coolly, his eyes remaining on Bakugo, unintimidated. No. His gaze drew away and then a moment later returned. Yes, actually, he said, still passive. If Midoriya ever shows up to class with any mysterious burns or bruises, I'm going to make it a point to make sure Aizawa notices. Bakugo blinked, his breath lodged somewhere halfway from his lungs. Had that freaky-eyed piece of shit really just said that to him? He rose from his seat. Oh, yeah? He could hardly get the words out for seething. The fuck are you? His keeper or some shit? Icy Hot didn't seem the least bit bothered by Bakugo drawing to his feet. No, just his friend. And like everyone else, I can see how unfairly things have turned out for Midoriya ever since you lured him away and attacked him outside the dorms. Bakugo was at Half-and-Half's desk now, nearly glaring literal fire as he looked down at him. He ignored the other students starting to filter in. Is that what you think happened? You scar-faced freak. Is that what you think happened? I know that's what happened, Icy Hot responded calmly, looking up at him unperturbed. Midoriya can't be provoked into fighting, so either you threatened him or manipulated him to get him in that kind of trouble with you. Probably both. Bakugo's hand shot out, gripping Half-and-Half's blazer in a death grip, ready to kill him on the spot. But there were too many kids around now, and Deku was suddenly there as well, wedging his way between them and pushing Bakugo back. And he vaguely noticed Kirishima had come out of nowhere and had a hand on his arm to, Hey, Kaken, stop. What are you doing? Take a breather, Bakugo. Aizawa's gonna be here any minute. Get the hell off. Don't touch me. He spat at red and green hair, pulling his arm free as he released icy hot and turned away. Deku, he said, livid. Tell your multicolored watchdog to stay the hell away from me if he knows what's good for him. He was glad he didn't have to see the unbearable wide-eyed look of puzzlement Deku was undoubtedly aiming between half and half and him. He was already back at his desk, chest heaving as he fought to calm down. And he'd thought that morning couldn't possibly have gotten more annoying. Wrong again, he realized, as shitty Deku took a seat right next to him. Ugh. The class lecture began and dragged on for much longer than it seemed to have any right to. Bakugo had to reach over and grip Deku's arm in a painful squeeze, no less than 3 times to get his incessant mumbling to shut up. It was annoying as hell. There was finally only about a half hour of Aizawa's class left when a slip of paper landed on Deku's desk. Bakugo eyed it in annoyance, and then grew even more annoyed that he'd even noticed it in the first place. He didn't want Deku's shitty business to distract him any further than it already had. And then when Deku unfolded it, revealing a series of mismatched handwriting with Bakugo's name mentioned, he wasn't sure why it made him seethe as much as it did. What the hell was the shitty nerd spreading about him now? It shouldn't have bothered him. He didn't give a shit what the extras thought of him. It was only because of Icy Hot's confrontation earlier, and Kirishima's concern for shitty Deku the previous night, and everyone sending him indignant looks anytime he caught their eyes on him. Because apparently he was ruining the life of their precious Deku. It was aggravating as hell. He wasn't the only one who had gone at it at ground beta. Deku, that bastard, had gone just as hard. He wasn't a victim here. He wasn't getting his ass stomped on and handed to him like he had in the past. He could handle it now. And all these shitty clowns should just mind their own business and shut the hell up. Got him. He grabbed for the stupid note. But he forgot how much faster shitty Deku was now. It was slipped from his reach and immediately folded up again away from him. What is that? Deku, you piece of shit. Why is my name on it? Bakugo said in a harsh whisper, leaning against Deku and grabbing for it. It's nothing. Don't worry about it, Deku whispered back, holding it out of his reach. You're talking about me to all these shitty extras, telling them how miserable your pathetic life is now. You son of a bitch. Bakugo made another grab for it, and Deku immediately tossed it away out of desperation. The class had fallen silent as Aizawa paused, his attention falling on the side-by-side desks that had been knocked slightly askew in the brief tussle. The note landed at the back of the aisle, near Icy Hot's feet. Aizawa had no patience. Todoroki, he said shortly, eyeing the folded note on the floor. Pick that up. Read it to the class. Deku stared in horror. Bakugo turned back around, mildly shaking his head at Deku's unbelievable stupidity. Icy Hot eyed the boys in front of him briefly before bending to pick it up. It was clear he really didn't want to. Some shithead, probably Kaminari, was already snickering. Todoroki took a seat and began unfolding the paper with a resigned sigh. Stand, please, Aizawa instructed. Todoroki slowly drew to his feet. He began in his usual monotone voice. Hey, I'm bored. Me too. This is totes? He paused a moment, glancing up. Mr. Aizawa? He asked, in as much of a pleading voice as his stoicism allowed. Did he really have to do this? More brave laughter. Continue. This is totes boring, Todoroki continued painfully. Ha, did you see Bakugo and Midoriya's new setup? Poor Midoriya. Oh my gosh, I know, he's such a cinnamon roll. Todoroki raised his eyes again, once more pleading with Aizawa. More snickering. Go on. Oh, we should ask Sato to bake some cinnamon rolls later. Maybe we could take some to Midoriya to cheer him up. Todoroki paused again briefly, drawing another resigned breath. Hi Deku, we heard about your new living situation, and we feel so sorry for you. How has it been going so far? Circle which best applies. Bad. Sucky. The worst ever. Your soul is already 50% more dead than it was yesterday. Several poorly stifled laughs broke out at that. Bakugo hunched down over his desk, his shoulders quivering. Deku's face was practically buried in his arms. Todoroki went on. We want to bring you a treat later, but since you can't escape the Lord Explosion murder, maybe we could meet in the common room instead. We'll text you. Stay strong, friend. Todoroki folded the note back up and sat down, his eyes on his desk. The restrained giggling immediately died down as Aizawa centered himself at the front of the class. He took a breath. Anyone willing to claim ownership of that note? Or am I going to have to punish the entire class? Furtive glances were sent back and forth for a few moments before Ashido's arm, and an invisible gloved hand tentatively lifted into the air. Ashido, Hagakure, Aizawa said, his no-nonsense gaze drifting between them. You're to stay after class for 20 minutes and write me a 500-word essay on why the discussion and consideration of the medically compromised citizen is, in fact, not totes boring. Ashido's head dropped in shame, as did everyone assumed Hagakure's as well. And don't think I don't realize the only reason you're passing notes is out of fear of having your phones confiscated, Aizawa added sternly. If this happens again, I'm going to confiscate them anyway. Bakugo was still mildly shaking in anger when the class was dismissed 20 minutes later. He was the first one out of his seat and out the door, and he didn't even notice Kirishima calling after him. Lunch rolled around, and the theme of the day was still going strong. Feeling more and more annoyed and shitty by the hour, Bakugo slammed his tray on a lone table, far from everyone else, and hunched down over his food. He was still fuming. He didn't get embarrassed. Being the best at pretty much anything, he was fairly close to being physically incapable of feeling embarrassment. Why had that shicho in class had him feeling so close to it, then? Was it hearing solid evidence of how everyone and their dog preferred Deku to him? He already knew that though, and he didn't give a shit that they chose that idiot loser over him. They didn't matter. No, he wasn't embarrassed. He was just angry. Angry that Deku continued to one-up him left and right ever since they'd arrived at UA. Ever since they'd applied for UA. Ever since their teacher at their shitty old middle school had even announced their mutual interest in UA. Shouldn't you be eating at Midoriya's table, Bakugo? Bakugo paused, fork midway to his mouth. He didn't bother glancing up. Glasses, I swear to God. If you want to live to attend Present Mike's class today, you better get the hell away from me right now. It's okay, Ida. Deku was there. Of course he was, the bastard. Bakugo couldn't shake him. I'll just sit over here, he said, heading to the opposite end of the table and setting his tray down. This should still technically count as eating together, right? Bakugo's breathing was tight as he unwillingly eyed Deku, wishing he could just catch an effing break for once. I suppose, Ida reluctantly agreed. I'll join you in a few, he said to Deku, turning to go get in line. Bakugo didn't glance at Deku again. He stayed focused on his food, trying to forget the nerd was even in the same cafeteria as him, let alone at the same table. But that became more and more difficult to do once Round Face joined the shitty nerd, followed by Icy Hot and Tail and Frog and Jacked Up Ears and Bird Brain, and Gah. He was done with this shit. He was about to stand up and get the hell out of there when Kirishima sat down across from him, joined by Pikachu on his left and Tape on his right. Hey, Bakugo, Kirishima greeted him with a grin and his usual painfully cheerful voice. Why was that idiot always in a good mood? It was infuriating. Oh man, that was hilarious, Kaminari said next to him, as usual without any preface as to what the hell he was talking about. Katsuki, the killer of souls, he laughed. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Bakugo gave him a sidelong glare. Since when the hell had Sparky grown so daring? He'd kill that off-brand Pokemon idiot. Yeah, it might be funnier if it wasn't Midoriya's soul in question. Tape added from his other side. Midori is a solid dude. You should try to lay off him a bit, Bakugo. Bakugo was shaking again, trying his hardest to keep from blowing the table and everyone added to unidentifiable smithereens. Kirishima must have noticed. Guys, he said, eyeing the two across from him meaningfully. Why don't you drop it for now? This hasn't exactly been easy for Bakugo either, you know? He paused a moment as Bakugo met his eyes with a challenge. I mean, being shut in with your longtime childhood rival and all, he clarified. Bakugo snorted derisively. Longtime childhood rival. More like longtime childhood thorn in my fucking side, he sneered. He's not my fucking rival. The others shared a wary look before turning to glance at Deku a moment, smiling his goddamn stupid, careless grin at something Roundface had just said. Oblivious to the fact people might be talking about him. Oblivious like he always was. Hezure seems to be, Kirishima offered. Just a hint timidly. Bakugo whipped his head to glare at him, daring him to go on. I mean, Kirishima explained quickly. Yaoyorozu's the one actually ranked first in the class. And Todoroki's the one who kinda screwed you over in the sports festival. He took a breath, quickly adding, which, by the way, wasn't anything against you at all. Shut up, shitty hair. Bakugo cut him off. He didn't give a shit for the reasoning behind Icy Hot's wussing out on him during their showdown at the festival. And he wasn't about to forgive him for it. And, dude, Kirishima was still talking for some foolish reason. Todoroki was the only other one apart from me who was adamant about going after you in Kamino Ward. Him and Midoriya. Hey, Kaminari broke in a moment, reddening slightly. I was for it, too. We were all worried. Zero added tentatively at the same time. Shut up, Bakugo cut in again, wondering why the hell Kirishima found it so imperative to defend Icy Hot, and daring him to keep talking about it. I don't give a shit about that half-and-half bastard. Yeah, Kirishima cut in again. I can tell. He was studying Bakugo for a brief moment. It's Midoriya you've marked as your main competition, and then added thoughtfully. Why? He paused again a brief moment. It's more than a childhood grudge. Haven't you idiots been paying attention? Bakugo asked, as if they were mentally inept. Haven't you noticed how fast he's been progressing? How often his techniques advance and change? How much more of a handle on his goddamn quirk he gains every goddamn week. The others glanced between themselves again. Bakugo huffed at their stupidity. Honestly, Bakugo added, fed up. If you idiots don't pay attention to shit like this, you're never going to get anywhere. Well, you know, Kirishima said, still thinking everything through. His quirk's still unidentifiable, he suggested. Yeah, he got it late, Kaminari added, shrugging. Maybe it still hasn't fully developed, and it keeps manifesting itself differently, or something. Maybe Midoriya's still learning about it as well. Bakugo scowled at them. Had it really taken them this long to come up with that? You know, Zero added, his voice dropping a fraction. We've heard the comparisons to All Might before, but Midoriya's quirk really is weirdly similar to how All Might started out. His voice was growing a little eager. You don't think there might actually really be some sort of relation? Stop right there, elbows. Bakugo cut in immediately, his voice firm, offering no room for objection. What? Zero asked, a little put out at being interrupted. You're the one who's all about noticing stuff and connecting dots. I would think you'd be the most curious about the All Might compare. Just shut up about it, all right? Bakugo interrupted again, his voice growing heated. Geez, jealous much? Kaminari snickered, taking a bite of his food. Bakugo gave him a look. Did you want to go back to class with a fork lodged in your trachea, Pika douchebag? Kirishima couldn't help grinning as Zero laughed. No, Kaminari replied through a mouthful. I'm not jealous, you goddamn moron, Bakugo said, trying to keep his heart rate from picking up as much as it was. Mmhm, Kaminari hummed around his food, unconvinced. God, that kid had gotten ballsy lately. I knew you guys were idiots, Bakugo went on. But I didn't think you were stupid enough to actually put any stock into such a lame-ass rumor, he spat. And then muttered a moment later. Stupidest rumor I ever effing heard of. Bakugo's breathing was still harsher than it should have been. He shouldn't have cared about the All Might comparisons. It really had no right being any of his business whatsoever. He didn't effing care. And yet there he found himself immediately trying to squash out any mention of the rumors before they even had a chance to be spoken. What? Was he suddenly helping that goddamn nerd out? Protecting his secret? Goddamn it, no, he wasn't. He would never help that goddamn idiot. And yet, the thoughts of all the possible repercussions wouldn't stop whispering at the back of his mind. If the truth got out, All Might would be in deep shit for putting so much responsibility and pressure on the shoulders of a kid. And Deku would be extremely vulnerable at his young age and with his limited grasp of the power. Who knew what sort of unwanted attention he'd immediately draw as soon as the truth got out? It would be a nightmare and an absolute mess. Goddamn it. Why did Bakugo have to go prying in the first place? This was what happened when you went sticking your nose where it didn't belong. You got stuck with a shitton of responsibilities that you should never have had anything to do with in the first place. Effing hell. But, if you really think about it, Zero ventured again tentatively. Drop it, tape. Bakugo said, his voice taking on a familiar dangerous edge. It meant he was done talking. Bakugo noticed another cautious look get passed between them. He exhaled sharply, thoroughly annoyed, and stood to go dump his tray, his appetite gone. The afternoon wore on in similar shitty fashion, and when evening finally and thankfully took its place, Bakugo went out to a run, a few laps around campus to clear his head, showered, ate, and found himself alone in Deku's shitty dorm room for once. Maybe he could finally get a decent homework session in. Bakugo tried his hardest to stay focused on his work in front of him. He tried his best not to think about his friend's speculation surrounding Deku. And he really attempted to ignore the nagging thoughts of what would happen if Deku was found out. Why the hell should he care? It was All Might's fault for choosing a wimpy loser like Deku, who couldn't keep his damn mouth shut. And it was Deku's fault for thinking his useless self might actually be capable of harnessing All Might's powers. It was all such a load of shit. They were both idiots. Still though, Bakugo couldn't keep back the nagging reminder that he had promised. He'd promised All Might he'd help keep their secret under wraps. Why had he gone and done such a stupid thing like that? He didn't care who the hell found out about them. It wasn't his goddamn business. But even so, they were trusting him now, holding him to it. Bakugo didn't give a shit about helping either one of them. But he'd be damned if his word didn't mean anything. He'd stay quiet. He'd keep attempting to throw off any curiosity aimed their way. He wouldn't like it, but he'd still do it. It really would be a shitshow if the truth got out, and Bakugo didn't want anything to do with that. He sighed, tapping his pencil a few times and trying to get back down to goddamn work. It was a little after 9:30 when Deku finally showed up. Apparently, he'd been wasting what could have been productive study time down in the common area. Hey, Deku greeted him uncertainly, closing the door behind him. Bakugo didn't turn to look at him. He came in and shrugged his blazer off. The silence must have been a little uncomfortable, or he just felt like talking for some idiotic reason or something. You get some good studying in? He asked. Bakugo released a short breath through his nose. Better than you. I don't know why any of you assholes attempt to get any work done down there. Yeah. I guess it's not the quietest of places for homework. Bakugo just kept writing away, ignoring him. You probably don't care, but there were a few of Sato's sweet rolls left over, and he said they don't keep very well, so I brought one up. In case, you might want it. He had made his way to their desks and set a plate down on the edge of his. Bakugo didn't lift his head, just eyed it a moment before going back to writing. I don't eat that shit. Oh, I figured that might be the case. Bakugo tossed his pencil down, sitting up and half turning to face the nerd. What do you want? Deku was rubbing the back of his neck, looking anxious and stupid, like always. He avoided Bakugo's questioning gaze, dropping his bag at the foot of his chair. Oh, Deku sounded a little surprised that Bakugo immediately knew something was up. But stupid Deku could be easier to read than the top line of an eye exam chart at times. At others, often trickier than the bottom line. Bakugo hated those times. I'm just sorry about earlier, Deku finally spat out, undoing his button down and pulling a shirt and sweats from his drawers. He might have had the guts to say it, but not to face Bakugo at the same time. Bakugo scoffed, twisting further in his chair. You're sorry, he hissed. You think I give a shit what any of those extras think about me? About what you think of me? He demanded, furious. No, Deku cut in quickly, pulling his t-shirt down in place. It's just I justy know what it's like to feely dunno, alone, I guess. Bakugo was trying to keep his shoulders from heaving. Of course you do, you fucking idiot. You've been a worthless, friendless loser your entire life. You're the go-to expert on the subject, he spat. Why in the hell was Deku offering him pity? His blood was pounding, and it felt heated as hell. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I want to be alone, you goddamn moron? That maybe I'm not alone enough in this goddamn place? Goddamn it. Get the hell out of here with your sorry, you goddamn piece of shit. Deku was sitting on the edge of his bed now, staring at his phone's blank screen on his lap. Sorry, he said quietly. I wasn't trying to make you mad. I justy don't know. What? Bakugo demanded, hating Deku's infuriating habit of not finishing sentences. Deku hesitated before answering, likely weighing whether or not it was worth getting the shit beat out of him over. Even if you do choose to be alone, that still can't make it not suck at times. Bakugo's breath was heaving enough to nearly hurt his chest. Listen, you stupid son of a bitch. Just because the extras haven't caught on to the fact that you're a useless waste of space with nothing but delusions you parade around as aspirations doesn't mean they won't sooner or later. Bakugo knew he was likely inching dangerously close to the line of drawing tears with that. And that was the absolute last thing he wanted to deal with at the moment. But for some reason he just couldn't stop. The goddamn nerd had practically been begging to be put back in his place lately. So stop fooling yourself into thinking you have some sort of pathetic experience in the friendship department, especially when it comes to us. We're not friends, Deku. Bakugo's eyes were fire as he stared Deku down. We never have been, and we never will be. And if you ever make me remind you of that fact again, I'll beat it into your skull so hard you won't ever be able to forget it. He took another shaky, fuming breath. Aizawa may be forcing this piss-poor charade for the time being, but it doesn't mean shit. Deku just sat there a moment, still staring down at his blank phone, still unmoving. Bakugo just stared, breathing heavily. Finally, Deku offered a subtle nod, neither raising his eyes or saying anything. What, are you gonna cry now? Bakugo challenged, the heat behind his voice replaced by a sneer. Deku silently offered a faint shake of his head, despite his eyes suddenly shimmering in the lamplight. He slowly pulled his legs up and under his covers, turning as far away as he could and burying himself against his pillow. Bakugo merely watched him a moment, the harsh rise and fall of his chest a hint more painful than it had been a moment ago. Goddamn it, Deku, are you crying? Bakugo pressed. You're 16 now, for God's sake. When the hell are you going to grow out of that useless, chicken shit, goddamn girl habit? He demanded. What, you're not talking to me now? TCH. Fine. See if I care. Moron. He turned back to his studies, but he knew any attempts at concentrating would be futile. He was too worked up. He was too upset. He was too agitated. And goddamn it, Deku's quiet sniffling was making his stomach feel not entirely pleasant. If he was being honest. Ugh. That asshole. He could cry all he wanted. Bakugo didn't give a shit. Will you just say something, asshole? Deku sniffed and coughed, and Bakugo looked over to him somewhat expectant. No, not expectant. What the hell? He didn't give a damn if the shitty nerd stayed silent for the rest of the night. For the rest of eternity, for that matter. It was a welcome change for once. Look, Deku finally broke the tense silence, his voice thick and shaky. All I was trying to do was be nice, he explained through slightly hiccuping breaths. It sounded a little ridiculous. Not commit you to a lifetime of friendship. I know how you feel about me, Kaken. I've always known, and I promise you I couldn't forget it if I tried. He sniffed and struggled to swallow, continuing. I was just worried you might have felt bad about the things that were said earlier. That's all. Bakugo was on his feet and across the room, roughly grasping Deku's shoulder and forcing him around to look at him. Don't do that. It was difficult to get out with how tight his teeth were clenched. Deku's eyes were bloodshot and startled. He attempted to raise his arms, but they were tangled in his blankets. What? Don't ever offer me your pity, Deku. Bakugo stated in no uncertain terms. Deku started to reply, but Bakugo pressed his hand solidly over his face, cutting off his voice and squeezing maybe a little tighter than he might have meant to. No, shut up, he said, as he cut Deku off. Don't ever assume I feel bad about anything, because I don't. I don't ever. Do you understand that? Deku could only nod, a hint of pain pinching his brow slightly. Bakugo stared at him a moment longer before finally releasing him. He hated the way Deku was looking back at him just then. It was making his stomach twinge again. Bakugo dropped down to the floor with a resigned sort of sigh. A long and heavy-laden moment passed before he finally spoke. I promise I don't care that the extras prefer you over me, he stated. It doesn't get to me, so don't let it get to you. He paused another beat before adding, all right? He wasn't facing Deku, but he could practically feel how the nerd merely blinked at him in bewilderment. That was enough sappy shit for the evening. For the year, really. Bakugo didn't say anything more, just slowly drew to his feet and made for the bathroom, glimpsing the lone cinnamon roll sitting untouched at his desk on the way. The sight of it made his stomach clench again for some unknown reason. The day had been shit, and it was past time for bed. Andy was tired. It took a long time for Izuku to fall asleep that night. His short, staccato breaths had evened out a while ago, and his eyes didn't even feel all that puffy anymore. But still, sleep kept its distance. He really hadn't meant to let Kaken's words get to him. Not to the point of tears, at least. He thought he was done with that. It was embarrassing and unnecessary. Granted, Kaken wasn't by any means a stranger to his tears being the cause of them more often than not throughout their childhood. But he was determined to show Kaken he'd grown. He was stronger now. Kaken's words didn't hold as much weight as they used to. Didn't cut as deeply. But even so, all he could hear whenever he shut his eyes against his pillow was the cruel echo of what had been said. You're a useless waste of space with nothing but delusions you parade around as aspirations. Why had that gotten to him so bad? He knew Kaken likely hadn't actually meant to throw out something hurtful enough to drive him to tears, and he was mad at himself that it had. It's just, it had hit a little too close to home with his current struggles and self-doubts. Kaken had always been good at that, fishing out Izuku's current weaknesses and soft spots, and exploiting them by hitting them hard. Was Izuku delusional? Were his goals and aspirations merely delusions of grandeur? Had he been a complete fool to believe he might actually be capable and worthy of making one for all his own? Of chasing after the position of #1 hero, and giving everything he had in order to fill the impossibly large vacancy left by All Might? Kaken certainly seemed to think he was a fool, But did that mean everyone else would as well, if they knew the truth? Had he really been chasing after false hopes and dreams all this time? Had All Might wasted his gift on such a wrong and weak successor? Did he wish he had chosen differently? Someone more like Kaken? No, that couldn't be right. All Might had chosen him when he had literally nothing. When he had been literally nothing. If All Might hadn't regretted his choice in the beginning, there was no way he could be regretting it now. Izuku had come so far since then. He'd worked so hard. He wasn't the same boy that had desperately clung to All Might's legs with nothing but teary wishes and hopeful suppositions all that time ago. He was making one for all his own. And it was becoming his more and more every day. He was showing potential. He knew he was. No, Kaken was merely fighting a little dirty psychologically. And maybe he didn't even realize it. Maybe he just felt threatened to the point of lashing out blindly, without any real awareness of the effects his words might have. Or maybe he was as malicious as he sounded, and he really had meant every word of it. Izuku didn't really think so. He'd seen very brief snippets of humanity in Kaken before. And he could be wrong, but it nearly sounded as if Kaken had almost shown the faintest hints of remorse after what he'd said. Or at least as close to faint hints of remorse as Kaken was capable of. Izuku knew he would never show true remorse. He probably wasn't even able to feel true remorse, but the way he'd prodded Izuku to stop crying and talk to him had definitely not been like the Kaken he was familiar with. Even if he still hadn't exactly been nice about it. But actually, in all fairness, what had Kaken's display at Ground Beta been, if not an example of true remorse? Kaken had been broken up. Overwhelmed with guilt over his supposed cause of All Might's downfall. He hadn't been able to handle it, and didn't know how to process or deal with all the pent-up emotion from dwelling on it. That had been the first real showing of Kaken's hidden humanity. And Izuku could still hardly believe he'd been the one Kaken had turned to with it. He'd been the only one Kaken could turn to with it. It almost gave Izuku a sense of responsibility for Kaken, in some way. Not that they were friends, or anything near it. No, Kaken had made that very clear. But Kaken did carry more with him than just anger. There was a lot more to him he kept hidden. And Izuku would likely continue to be the only person whom Kaken might reveal those buried emotions to. Not intentionally, Izuku was certain of that. But because of their newfound shared knowledge and trust regarding All Might and One for All. Even so though, Izuku would try his best to be there for Kaken when he needed to vent. Even if he knew how Kaken's venting would usually undoubtedly go. Dealing with Kaken was like, well, it was kind of like trying to defuse a literal bomb, almost. Like those scenes in movies where the main guy is faced with the dilemma of which wire to cut, while a countdown stares him in the face, getting nearer and nearer to 0 o'clock. That was like Kaken. Should Izuku say this or not say this? Should he cut this wire or that one? He never knew. And more often than not, Kaken exploded no matter what he did. It was nerve-wracking and exhausting. But Izuku liked to think he was at least getting a little better at handling it. At least getting a little more used to being around him so much. Regardless though, Izuku knew Kaken at least took him more seriously now. Their match at Ground Beta had shown him that. Kaken's desperation at how close he'd come to losing. His quiet acceptance of All Might's confession. His nod to Izuku being the chosen one. Kaken saw him as a true rival now. There couldn't be any doubt of that. And Izuku had to live up to Kaken's newfound expectations of him. And not just live up to them, but surpass them. Right then. No more crying. Not ever in front of Kaken, at least. Kaken was right. It was a pointless habit he should have outgrown by now. Granted, he couldn't really help having a much higher emotional capacity than Kaken, or pretty much anyone else in their class. But he could learn to get a better handle on it. And he would. It would be vital in his efforts to talk to Kaken in the future. And there was still so much Izuku knew he had to talk to him about. Or at least attempt, anyway. He was pretty certain any attempts at conversation would only end up unintentionally provoking Kaken. But they couldn't get anywhere if he didn't at least try. He rolled over and pulled his pillow closer. Ugh, why couldn't he just stop thinking already? He needed to sleep. He could hear Kaken's even breathing across the room, and he flipped over again with a faint and slightly envious huff. He tossed and turned. He got up to get a drink. He got up again to pee. He went back to trying to shut his brain off. It was no good. Sleep wouldn't come. Finally, glancing at his phone at 12:47 m, Deku decided to switch his alarm off, grateful he had the option since the following day was Saturday. It would be pointless trying to function on 5 hours of sleep or less. He wasn't sure when exactly sleep finally claimed him, but it felt like hardly any time passed at all before he was drawn back to awareness by the sound of his bedroom door opening and closing, followed by a loud voice. "What the hell? Why are you still asleep?" Izuku groaned faintly and stretched as much as his fatigued body allowed, trying to ease himself from sleep's unrelenting grasp. He rolled over to meet Kaken's gaze, his eyes blinking heavily. "The hell's wrong with you?" Kaken asked, stepping further inside and heading to his desk. Izuku stretched again, choosing not to reply through a yawn. He reached for his phone. 8:19 a.m. Dang, the morning was pretty much wasted. Kaken had turned his attention away, pulling his bag up on his chair and loading it with books. Izuku sat up, running a hand through his hair and rubbing a bleary eye. He stared at the floor and yawned again. Waking up was hard sometimes. "You sick or some shit?" Kaken hadn't turned back to address him. He was still piling study materials into his bag. "No." Izuku's voice had finally decided to be somewhat functional. "Just didn't sleep well last night." Kaken eyed him out of the corner of his eye a moment but didn't respond. "What's that?" Izuku asked after a moment, pointing vaguely. Kaken had been carrying a bowl with him, which now sat on his desk in front of him. Kaken released a short breath through his nose, as if annoyed Izuku had noticed. "My leftovers," he responded shortly. Izuku hummed, noncommittally. He scrubbed a hand through his hair again, finally feeling more awake. Kaken seemed a little averse to continuing, but he did so anyway. "I made too much food, and none of the other lazy-ass extras were up and around to eat the rest of it. And it's good as hell, so I didn't want to throw it away." Was Kaken suggesting what Izuku thought he might be? He'd have to be careful with how he approached this, if that was the case. Stick with noncommittal, he decided. "I'll eat it," Izuku shrugged, and then quickly added a moment later, "if no one else is going to." Kaken zipped his bag closed, and after a moment muttered, "Fine, whatever." Izuku pushed himself to his feet and stepped over to grab the bowl. "Thanks," he said, climbing back on his bed. Kaken looked to him sharply, studying him a brief moment. "Don't go misinterpreting this as some sort of lame-ass peace offering or some shit, you stupid nerd," he warned. "Because I'll throw that shit in the trash right now." Izuku snorted around a mouthful, lowering the chopsticks. He chewed a moment while Kaken glared at him. "Nah, I know your cooking's just too good to waste," he offered. Kaken watched him a second longer, apparently deliberating whether to be mad or not. He finally dropped his gaze and shouldered his bag. "You're goddamn right it is." Kaken turned for the closet and pulled out a hoodie while Izuku went back to his breakfast hungrily. It really was good. "Listen," Kaken said, draping his sweatshirt over his arm. "I plan to get caught up on the rest of my shit today, and I don't want to be bothered." Izuku just chewed, listening. "So if Four Eyes gets on our case for not studying and shit together today, just, I don't know, deal with him, okay?" Izuku swallowed. "'Kay, that's fine," he offered, and then added, "Did you already train?" Kaken tilted his head in annoyance at him. "Of course I did, you idiot. It's practically lunchtime already." I don't know where the hell you get off thinking you can just waste the weekend effing sleeping. Moron, he muttered. Izuku glanced down before continuing somewhat hesitantly. We should maybe try to train together tomorrow, he suggested. And then quickly added, before Ida says anything to Aizawa. Kaken had a hand on the door, but turned his head to afford him one more annoyed look. Yeah, maybe, whatever. I'm all for any chance to kick your ass. He pulled the door open. You'll have to get your goddamn lazy ass out of bed though, 'cause I'm not starting later than 6. Right, Izuku said, dropping his gaze as he idly poked at his food. Kaken closed the door behind him, and Izuku sat staring at it for a long moment. Anka, what just happened? Had Kaken actually felt bad about the previous night enough to attempt to make up for it with breakfast? Is that what just happened there? Because it sure kinda seemed that way, despite Kaken's impressive efforts at playing it off like it was nothing. Okay, so maybe Kaken hadn't outright offered Izuku breakfast, exactly. But he had brought the extra food into the room without any intent to eat it himself, and with the clear idea and expectation that Izuku would be more than willing to. That kind of counted as bringing Izuku breakfast, right? What the heck? Okay, so Kaken was surprisingly capable of rare and unexpected moments of borderline niceness. And now that Izuku really thought about it, he'd actually seen snippets of it before. He recalled their first day of arriving at the dorms, how everyone had been feeling really down after all the rule-breaking surrounding Kamino Ward. Aizawa had really laid into them, and Kaken had felt guilty. Guilty that so much trouble centered around him. Kaken had felt bad. Izuku was sure he had seen it. The way Kaken had pulled Kaminari aside to trigger his quirk overload. Just for the sake of making everyone else laugh and to lighten the mood. And how he'd insisted Kirishima accept his money to replace what was spent on his rescue, with the offhand comment that he wouldn't be in his debt anymore. It had been thoughtful. Kaken was capable of thoughtfulness. Granted, Izuku knew Kaken would kill him on the spot if he ever actually voiced or even hinted at any of these observations. But still, that didn't lessen their validity. If Kaken was going to continue offering rare moments of actual borderline niceness, then Izuku was going to have to be very careful with how he accepted it. If he pointed it out, or made it obvious that Kaken was being anything less than hostile, he knew it would backfire immediately. If he played along like he didn't realize Kaken might actually be trying, it might be possible for them to eventually get somewhere. Maybe. There was hope, at least. Izuku eyed the dish in his lap once more, a muscle tugging at his mouth ever so slightly. It really was good. Bakugo was glad he didn't encounter anyone as he made his way to the library nearest their homeroom. It would be quiet there. He'd be alone. For once. And he'd have as long as he needed to finish all his shitty catch-up work and finally get back to his normal study schedule. He pulled out a chair at one of the round tables in the far corner and sat with a slightly exasperated sigh. It wasn't exactly how he wanted to spend his Saturday, but it would be a relief to finally get caught up and not be stressed about his workload so much anymore. He got his books out and pulled his hoodie on, letting the hood stay in place as he tugged it down over his shirt. He was a little surprised and relieved that shitty Deku had somehow managed not to piss him off too bad that morning. It was a lot easier to concentrate when he wasn't seething with annoyance at Deku's latest display of infuriating stupidity. The shitty nerd hadn't even mentioned anything about the previous night. Perhaps the idiot was finally learning he was slightly more tolerable when he actually kept his trap shut. But why the hell did that bastard have to cry so much still? He was way too old for that shit. And Bakugo hadn't even really been aiming for tears. If he'd let the stupid nerd really have it, he'd hate to think of the extent of waterworks he'd have to deal with. Maybe Bakugo was losing a little bit of his touch, but he seemed to remember making shitty Deku cry being a lot more satisfying in the past. Yeah, he'd been dying to put the idiot back in his place last night. But why did his stomach seem to clench just a little bit tighter the more biting his words became? God, Why was he even wondering about any of this shit? The fact that he was thinking about any of it alone made him want to punch something really hard. He didn't give a shit that stupid Deku couldn't keep himself from crying at the drop of a hat. Not when Deku realized how delusional and friendless he was. Not when All Might spoke to him through the media, telling him the burden of one for all was his alone now. Not when his stupid effing quirk broke his stupid effing bones because he possessed literally zero self-preservation skills. Not when Bakugo shoved him down time and time again, demanding he stop following him. Bakugo couldn't care less. Why in the hell was he dwelling on it then? He let out another irritated sigh. It had to be because of All Might. Because of what All Might had said to him when he'd pulled him aside that night after the ground beta incident. He didn't want to recall the words right then, but they kept coming back to him, whether he wanted them to or not. He wished he could forget them altogether. Young Bakugo, could I have a quick word with you before you leave for bed? What do you want? I know I don't have any right to your discretion, and I'm so grateful for how freely and generously you've offered it. Yeah, whatever. Just tell me what you want so I can go. I hesitate to ask this of Yao, especially in light of yours and Midoriya's history being brought to the forefront as fiercely as it was tonight. Just get to the point. Got him. I know it's unfair that I'm requesting this of Yao, but I want to ask you to attempt to shoulder some of this burden with Midoriya. What? In any way you see fit. It's an unfair and impossibly daunting burden I've placed on him. And you're the only of his peers who knows. The only one capable of understanding what he's going through. Of helping him get to where he needs to be to become who he needs to become. Why in the hell would you? You don't have to provide me with an answer, young Bakugo. Just think on it, please. And look after him. I can't always be there. And my powers. Well, anyway, thank you, young Bakugo. You're shaping up to be just the hero I expect of you. You're free to go now. Ugh. Why in the hell had All Might said any of that shit to him? And why the hell was he recalling it now? This was such bullshit. He shouldn't be thinking about anything but his goddamn homework. Fucking Deku. Screw that goddamn piece of shit son of a bitch. Why in the hell had All Might said all that to him? Especially when he knew about his and Deku's background. What, did All Might actually think Bakugo was capable of just tossing all that shit aside? Did he actually really think Bakugo was capable of tossing it all aside? No one else would have thought him capable of such nonsense. Why would All Might? Was it because All Might thought he was so freaking smart that he could see things in people others couldn't? Things they might not even be able to see themselves. No. It was all such bullshit. Screw All Might for thinking any of that. That sanctimonious bastard. And screw him for thinking effing Deku needed help in any way. The useless loser had gotten this far on his own just fine. Although technically not exactly on his own, he'd had All Might in his corner all along, just as Bakugo had suspected. Bakugo wasn't about to help that bastard become a better hero than him. No fucking way. Bakugo's frame may have taken on a slight quiver as he bent back over his work. He shoved all his aggravations to the back of his mind as hard as he could. They could rot there for all he cared. He wasn't going to let them distract him like this anymore. Bakugo was still silently fuming, but he somehow managed to get a couple solid hours of focusing in. And then, of course, out of nowhere, he heard the one last voice in the entire world he ever wanted to hear again. Of course he did. He was a fool to think he could get an effing break from the effing nerd for even half a day. He wasn't facing the entrance of the library, so he didn't see Deku enter. But he could hear him. Talking just a little too loud and being just a little too oblivious, like always. Bakugo was suddenly grateful for his hood as he leaned down lower over his homework. For some reason, he didn't want the shitty nerd to notice him. He wanted to just pretend the idiot wasn't there. That he didn't even exist at all. should just tell Aizawa it's too much. I mean, you really did draw the short straw with this whole thing. Everyone knows it's Bakugo that has the problem out of the two of you, not you. It was effing Roundface he was with. Of course it was. Their voices were coming from behind a row of books off to his side. Of course they were talking about him. Bakugo seethed hot as hell as he slumped down further over his books. It was taking everything in him not to blow the table away on the spot. Nah, I'm not gonna say anything. It's fine, I mean, it's nothing new. It's just how he is. I got used to it years ago. You know, Kaken and I grew up together. Yeah, I knew. I think everyone knows by now. Was he always that way, so angry and hateful? They were moving a little further down the aisle, searching for a book or something. Bakugo almost wished they would notice him, so he'd have an excuse to blow them both away where they stood. Pretty much. Well, no, actually Kaken would probably deny it. But we actually used to be good friends when we were really little. Our moms got us together all the time since we lived close. There was a reflective pause. Kaken was actually a really cool little kid. He was a lot of fun to tag along with, playing heroes and raving about All Might. Bakugo was certain someone might think he was having a goddamn seizure or something with how hard he was trying not to shake. What happened? HM? With your friendship, I mean. Why did he start, I don't know, being so mean to you? They were moving around another bend of books, but Bakugo could still hear them. Too well. I don't know, really. Another pause. Well, I mean, I do. Of course I do. Kaken got a quirk, and I didn't. That's all? Yeah, well, I think I started annoying him early on, being so fascinated by his quirk and all. But really, what 5-year-old kid could resist being in awe over a quirk like that? I mean, even now, who can resist it, regardless of age? Bakugo's jaw was starting to hurt from how tightly his teeth were grinding. He heard the nerd shrug. It's an awesome quirk. Kaken knew it, and he knew everyone else knew it, and I don't know, it might have got to his head a little bit. Bakugo clenched his fists even tighter. Don't spark. Don't spark. Don't spark. I'm not blaming him at all. He was just a little kid. We were both just little kids. Bucha. My quirk never developed till way later, and I don't think Kaken wanted anything to do with a quirkless kid. Got him his stomach for twinging just then. Bakugo tried again to still his quivering shoulders, but couldn't. Prejudiced, huh? Well, like I said, was just a little kid. Kids don't understand stuff like that. And his parents weren't that way, from what I remember of them. So I think it was more he just personally didn't like me. And I wasn't able to fight back. I was a pretty easy target, honestly. But it's not like it's nearly as bad as it used to be. A short, almost self-deprecating laugh. I mean, at least he's not telling me to jump off the roof anymore. Bakugo's insides might as well have just taken a hit from Half-and-Half's right side at how quickly they froze and seized up at that. A short intake of breath. Oh my gosh, did he really say that to you? When? How old were you guys? Ah. Deku trailed off a moment, seeming to regret mentioning it. Well, you know, I don't think he actually meant it. Why didn't you report him? To a teacher? Or someone? Anyone? Why in the hell was every rigid breath he was drawing stinging so goddamn much? Well, he could still hear Deku trying to backtrack. Teachers can't really do a whole lot. And I was fine, I mean, yeah, I wasn't exactly happy during those years, but I never would have considered hurting myself. I don't know, had dreams of being a hero, and hoped that things would eventually get better, which, I mean, look, they did. A pause. You still should have reported him. Another shorter pause. Nah, I couldn't. Why? A resigned sort of breath. I didn't want to affect Kaken's chances of getting into UA at all. They were both quiet at that, and the silence of a library had never felt so heavy to Bakugo before. Even when we were little, I always knew Kaken would go far. That he was meant to go far. And I always wanted to see for myself just how far he would end up going. I still want to see how far he'll go. I mean, despite everything. You're a good friend, Deku. A mild snort. Just don't ever let Kaken hear that. Another pause, the subject finally changing. Did you find what you were looking for? HM? Oh, yeah. Right here. We can go, sorry. They left, and Bakugo stayed hunched over his homework for a long time afterwards, neither looking at it or moving at all. The rest of the day passed more productively for Izuku than the morning had. He studied with Ida and Ochako, studied again by himself, and ate his meals with a small group of friends in the dining hall, swapping laughs and stories. He vaguely wondered where Kaken had been spending the day. He hadn't seen him at all. He must have been off hiding somewhere, making some serious progress on his homework. He was a little surprised Ida hadn't asked about him yet. The evening rolled around, and the night settling in saw the common room alight with activity. Izuku had claimed a spot on the main couch, and was idly browsing through his phone, while a series of squabbles continued around him. Please, can we do a rom-com? No, Ishido. That crappy movie you guys picked last week was a total chick flick, when you swore it wasn't. Weren't you paying attention? They didn't even end up together. Whoever heard of a chick flick where they don't even? It was still dumb as hell. Ojiro, what are you and Shoji looking at? Ooh, Sato, what have you got there? Oh, charge dolt, move over. Kaminari scooted right next to Izuku, with Gyro on his other side. Ochako had taken up residence on the smaller couch between Tuyeyurazu and Su. 10 noisy minutes passed, and it almost seemed like they were getting a little closer to finally agreeing on a movie when Kaken suddenly spoke up out of nowhere. Izuku hadn't even noticed him enter the common area. Deku. Kaken was standing back a ways behind the couches. The room fell silent at his voice. It was lined by a more dangerous edge than Izuku could recall hearing in a while. Izuku turned his gaze, and was immediately taken aback by the smoldering fury he saw behind Kaken's glare. His brows rose, questioning. They'd had a relatively civil morning, and he hadn't seen Kaken since. What was up? Do you have anything to say to me, asshole? Kaken's voice was low and guttural, hinting at a barely restrained rage. The heavy rise and fall of his chest was too noticeable. Ooh. Izuku briefly glanced around the group, wondering if anyone else might have some faint idea of what Kaken was getting at. He was at a loss himself. Do you? Izuku was pretty certain he'd seen a few flickering sparks around the vicinity of Kaken's fists. What the heck was he so mad about? Izuku hadn't done anything. He hadn't mentioned Kaken sharing his breakfast with him to anyone. And he had no intention to, either. No. What's wrong? Listen, you half-wit fucktard. If you ever have anything to say about me, you say it to my face. Do you understand that? You got him, son of a bitch? Izuku's stomach slowly slid down somewhere past his belly button. His gaze sought Ochako, and they shared an alarmed and dread-filled look. Bakugo, Kirishima said, drawing up from where he'd been slumped at the foot of the couch. Shut up. Kaken's voice was still dangerously level. Izuku briefly noted he almost sounded scarier when he wasn't shouting. Everyone was frozen, watching. Nervous. Izuku reluctantly met Kaken's fierce eyes again. And if you honestly think I owe you anything. Bakugo spat out. I don't owe you shit. Not for Kamino Ward, not for the fucking sludge villain, and not for my fucking acceptance into Yua. Izuku was just staring at him, his brow pinched with a perturbed sort of confusion. Kakani. Shut up. Just shut your fucking mouth for once in your goddamn life, Deku. Kaken held Izuku's eyes for a long, drawn-out moment, daring him to look away. The ferocity behind his stare hadn't lessened any, But Izuku didn't waver. He maintained their locked gaze, the troubled quirk in his brow deepening. After a thick silence that seemed to stretch forever, Kaken finally turned around and stalked away, heading for the stairs. The group seemed to release a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. "Got him," Kaminari finally said, drawing his gaze away from Kaken's direction and back to Izuku. "What the heck happened with you two today?" "It's just Bakugo being Bakugo," Zero said, addressing the group from one of the nearby tables. "Don't worry about it, Midoriya. He's probably just mad you mistook his pencil for yours, or accidentally knocked his towel on the floor or something. You know, the usual things that set Bakugo off." A few of the kids laughed lightly at that, hoping to ease the tension. Izuku's insides were roiling. Maybe I should go talk to him. He made to stand, but Kirishima held up a blocking arm. "Nah, let him cool off a while," Kirishima said. "He wants to sulk. We should probably just let him sulk for a bit." He turned his attention back to the group, his voice quickly returning to its usual genial tone. "Now are we starting a movie or what? What takes?" Izuku spent the movie chewing on the inside of his lip and feeling all sorts of turbulent emotions tumble through him. He was hardly aware of what he was watching, and he wanted it to both end already, because it was garbage, and yet never stop playing, so he wouldn't ever have to go up to his room again. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore and left, while the movie was just past its midpoint. He needed to talk to Kaken. He felt several pairs of anxious eyes follow him as he weaseled his way out of the group and slipped away upstairs. His heart rate picked up as he rounded the second floor, and his breathing was a little faster than it should have been as he reached his door. He paused, taking a deep breath before opening it. It was dark. Kaken had gone to bed. Izuku stepped quietly inside, waking his phone for light as he gently closed the door behind him. He stood there a moment, listening. It was so quiet in there. A little too quiet. Izuku silently crossed the floor, taking a seat on the edge of his bed. "I can tell you're not asleep." "Well, I'm not now, asshole." "You were in the library," Izuku stated, almost accusing. "Why didn't you say anything?" He was a little surprised he was finding it difficult to keep his voice level. He sounded indignant, and considering how he felt at the moment, he was more than okay with that. "Maybe because I didn't want to say anything to you, you idiot. Maybe because I didn't even want to fucking see you. Why the hell do you think I was there in the first place? That conversation wasn't meant for you." The rustle of blankets. Kaken must have sat up. "Listen, shithead. If you ever have anything to say about me, you can either shove it up your goddamn ass, or you can say it to my face." "No, I can't." Something about Izuku's insides felt like they were being held together by a single fraying thread. "I can't say anything to you. Nothing. Do you know why? Because you blow up in my face. Every time, without fail, no matter what it is I want to say." Izuku knew he was treading dangerous waters, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. It was like the thread had snapped and everything was unraveling. "All that crap you overheard earlier? All that shit I've been wanting to say to you for years, but never could? That wasn't meant for you. Not yet. Not like that." Izuku felt a faint warning stinging behind his eyes, and he pushed it away, choosing instead to roll it into his anger. He wasn't going to cry. He'd promised himself. And he was so done with Kaken's bullshit. Why did he have to overhear all that? To overhear everything? That wasn't supposed to happen. A lamp switched on, blinding Izuku for a moment. Kaken righted himself from reaching over his desk and was sitting up on his bed, staring at him. Izuku could have likely read a lot behind that stare, if he wasn't so distracted by his own anger at the moment. The only thing that really stood out to him was Kaken's complete incredulity. Kaken seemed at a loss for words. He just continued to stare at Izuku with such a convoluted mixture of disbelief and hate, and Izuku couldn't stand it. All the threads were unraveling further, and there was nothing to stop it. Before he even knew what was happening, Izuku launched himself at the other boy across the room. He didn't know why he was so angry. It wasn't like him to get so worked up. But Kaken had overheard words that were only meant for a friend. And Kaken had made it very clear that they would never be friends. And as such, Kaken should never have had the right to hear any of it. Not how Izuku would never be able to forget Kaken's suggestion of killing himself. Not how Izuku had silently put up with Kaken's incessant bullying out of fear. He might hinder the chances of his tormentor achieving his dreams. Not how, despite everything, Izuku was still cheering Kaken on, genuinely wanting him to achieve everything he ever hoped to. No, those were words that should have been willingly offered and received, without the threat of an ensuing fight or explosion. He and Kaken had made absolutely zero progress. And yet Kaken had heard it all. Kaken was on his feet in a split second, meeting Izuku halfway with a growl. They grappled with each other, tightly gripping at arms and shirts and throwing hindered punches when an opening arose. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement not to use their quirks. Neither of them were far gone enough in their anger to risk expulsion. Kaken was thrown into the dresser. Izuku was rammed against one of the beds. They ended up on the floor, swapping wrestling holds and gasping for breath. They weren't attempting to hit each other anymore. It was just a matter of who pinned who now. "Why do you hate me so freaking bad?" Izuku could barely get it out as he momentarily gained the upper hand over Kaken, holding as much of his weight over him as he could. "Why do you want me to kill myself?" Izuku said, squashing Kaken as hard as he could into the floor. Kaken was done with that. He twisted hard and got a leg under Izuku, throwing him harshly off. He was on him in less than a second. "Why do you take everything so goddamn seriously?" Kaken huffed as he flipped Izuku onto his back. "Like I actually meant for you to jump off the goddamn roof, you goddamn moron." "So you were joking?" Izuku demanded, fighting to keep his arms from being pinned. He was quickly losing energy. He'd give it one last push, but he knew he was nearly done. Finally, Kaken found himself solidly on top of Izuku, straddling his torso and gripping each of his wrists firmly above his head. Izuku couldn't move. It was over. They sat there, breaths heaving, Kaken refusing to let up in case Izuku found some more fight in him. "If you really were joking," Izuku heaved, eyes closed briefly as he sought to regain his breath. "Why don't you say it to me again?" "What?" Kaken spat, glaring down at him, his grip on Izuku's wrists still unrelenting. "Tell me to kill myself." Izuku's lungs were finally calming somewhat. Kaken's brow furrowed further in anger. "Go ahead and say it. I'm not playing your fucking game, Deku. You can't. See? Somehow, even you are capable of realizing how messed up that is now." Kaken ground his teeth with a hint of a growl, his eyes boring into Izuku beneath him. "Why in the hell would you hold on to some fucking offhand comment made when we were fucking 12? You and your goddamn fragile girl feelings. Kaken, telling someone to kill themselves is never an offhand comment. And it was only last year that you said it. Just shut the hell up about it. None of that shit even matters now. It does to me. That's because you're a freaking girl, and the most whiny-ass crybaby I've ever met. If you're waiting for an apology, shitty Deku, you'll be waiting a very long fucking time. I don't do apologies, and there's no way in hell I'm about to start with you." Izuku just closed his eyes in resignation, wondering what he had been hoping to achieve that evening in the first place. He sighed, struggling weakly against Kaken in hopes he'd finally let up. "We can't keep doing this." Kaken gave Izuku's wrists a painful squeeze before finally releasing him and climbing off to the floor. "What?" he finally offered, realizing Izuku wouldn't go on otherwise. Izuku just stayed unmoving on the floor, chest rising and falling evenly. "This daily fighting, it's too exhausting." Kaken stayed on the floor, too, leaning against his bed. If you weren't such an insufferable asshole, we wouldn't fight so much. Izuku just scoffed, wanting to flip that statement right back around on Kaken, but deciding not to. Right. He finally offered, sighing and pushing himself to his seat. He'd realized they weren't going to get anywhere. He slowly drew to his feet and made his way to the bathroom. He was past ready to go to bed. When he re-emerged 10 minutes later, Kaken was back in his bed and the light was off. Izuku climbed under his covers, his body stiff and sore from their unexpected brawl. They lay there in silence for a long time, both listening to the other's breathing, waiting to see who fell asleep first. Finally, after another long while, Izuku spoke into the darkness. "Kaken, can I ask you something?" "No." "Oh, well, you don't have to answer if it's hard for you to talk about, but..." "What? Just spit it out." "What did Shigaraki say to you in Kamino Ward? What did he want from you?" "Why are you asking?" Izuku shrugged. "Just curious, I guess." "Bullshit." "Huh? I know what you're doing, Deku." What do you mean?" "You're trying to build a profile on Shigaraki, aren't you? On all the villains, aren't you? Just like you've done with all the heroes." "Well, what's wrong with that? If I was, because it's none of your goddamn business. That's what. The pros will handle the villains. Just keep your nose out of it." A silence fell once more. Izuku tried again. "Well, when Shigaraki pulled me aside at the Kiyashi Ward Mall." "What?" "When he drew me away at the shopping center to talk to me." "When the hell did that happen?" "I dunno, a little while ago." "Shigaraki showed up at the mall to talk to you." "Yeah. Did you not hear about this?" "No. No one ever tells me a goddamn thing." "Were you alone?" "Yeah, I guess." "What do you mean, you guess?" "Well, there were a ton of other people around, and a bunch of our classmates were in the area. But yeah, I was alone when he talked to me." "What did he want?" "Just to talk. It was really weird. He mostly wanted my thoughts on Stain." "Did he threaten you?" "Not too bad." "What do you mean, not too bad, you idiot?" "Either he threatened you, or he didn't." "Well, yeah. But I didn't feel like I was in too much danger, really." "Did he try to draw you away?" "Not too far. Like I said, he just sat me down in the middle of the shopping strip to talk." "Got him, Deku. You freaking idiot. Don't you know that's attempted kidnapping?" "Well, yeah. I spent the rest of the day at the police station talking to Detective Tsukachi." "So, you at least reported it?" "Yes, of course I reported it." "What did the cops say about it?" "I don't know. That doesn't even matter." "What I was trying to..." "Yes, it does, dumbass. Did they think you were targeted? Or that it was coincidental?" "I don't know." Izuku was starting to get a little impatient at Kaken's endless interruptions. "I think they suspected coincidental. Like I said, that's not even relative." "Yes, it is. You gotta moron. You don't get it, do you?" Kaken fumed. "What?" "You can't get involved in anything related to those villains. Shigaraki especially." "I'm not planning to." "That means not even any profiling, Deku." "I'm serious." "What the heck do you care?" "I don't care, asshole. But you have the effing responsibility to All Might to watch your own ass and stay safe. And not get involved in anything concerning Shigaraki." "I don't." Izuku was at a loss for the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. What was Kaken talking about? "Just drop it, all right," Kaken said shortly, effectively ending the conversation. And then decided to add a moment later. "If you're still planning on getting your ass handed to you in training tomorrow, you better get the hell to sleep." Izuku stayed silent in response, knowing it would be a long while yet till sleep found him. Another long moment passed. "By the way, shitty Deku, you said shit earlier. Wonder who I could have possibly picked that up from. He could have been very wrong." But Izuku was 85% certain Kaken had stifled a snort just then. Bakugo flipped his pillow over for the third time in the last 20 minutes, needing punching it and silently fuming at himself for still being awake. He could hear Deku across the room, his light and paced breathing indicating sleep had found him a while ago, and Bakugo couldn't help seething further. Effing Deku was the one who had brought up all the shit that was currently hindering Bakugo's sleep. And yet he had the nerve to not be bothered by it enough to disrupt his own rest, while Bakugo continued to toss and turn. It was bullshit. Ugh. Stop thinking about it. He couldn't though. No matter how hard Bakugo tried to turn his brain off. The stupid nerd's oblivious voice from the library kept coming back to him again and again, over and over. Deku's casual explanation of Bakugo's perpetual anger just being how he was Deku's, dare Bakugo say, fond reminiscing over their shitty playtimes together as kids. Deku's accusing, but in the least accusatory way Bakugo of dropping him as a friend because he was quirkless, and then not really letting the blame fall anywhere, not on Bakugo, not on his parents, not even on himself for being quirkless, just shrugging it off as two little kids who didn't understand and couldn't work things out. Deku's willing dismissal of Bakugo's suggestion of killing himself as something Bakugo surely couldn't have meant, because Bakugo was meant to go far as a hero, not a villain. And Deku wasn't about to let himself get in his way, no matter how much Bakugo tormented him, or made him out to be a barrier when no threat even existed yet. Fuck him. Deku had never reported any of Bakugo's relentless bullying, because he knew it would reflect on Bakugo's record. Because he knew it would pretty much screw his chances of getting accepted into UA. Fuck him. Screw him for even remembering all of that shit in the first place. Could the stupid nerd let nothing go? Screw him for realizing the implications it could have had on his future, and never pointing it out to Bakugo at the time. For never using it as some form of leverage or retaliation against Bakugo. Screw him for never fighting back. For never letting Bakugo get what was coming to him for his childish, and yeah, okay, somewhat inexcusable behavior. And screw Deku for not even throwing any of it in his face, even now. For actually being upset that Bakugo had inadvertently heard all his thoughts on the subject. But why the hell had Deku been so mad about Bakugo merely hearing it? Shouldn't he have been upset about the actual content of what was said? About the past. Scratch that, shouldn't Bakugo have been the one with a right to be angry? Angry that Deku thought he was so freaking clever, and was planning to keep all that shit to himself, only to hold it over Bakugo's head at some later time. A more opportune time? But no, EFF that freaking nerd. Bakugo knew he wasn't keeping it all from him in order to throw it in his face later. Bakugo knew Deku was keeping it to himself for the chance at a possible reconciliation down the road. Fuck him. Why did he have to act so damn high and mighty all the time? Why had he never just fought back and gotten legitimately angry for once in his goddamn life? Yeah, Deku had shown an unexpected spark of something close to anger earlier that night. For the first time ever. When he'd confronted Bakugo about his accidental eavesdropping and initiated their little scuffle. But it should have been more than a spark. It should have been full-blown, indignant anger. Enough to have made him win their fight. But Deku would never do that. He'd never tap into anger, not even when it was rightly due to him, and use it to actually win for once. He was an effing pushover, and he always would be. Those words weren't meant for you. Not yet, not like this. Why in the hell was that stupid idiot still holding out hope for a potential reconciliation between the two of them? How many effing times did Bakugo have to let him know that just wasn't happening? That it just wasn't possible? Ugh. Bakugo buried himself in his pillow for the millionth time. Nah, I'm not gonna say anything. It's fine, it's just how he is. I got used to it years ago. Well, no, actually. Kaken was actually a really cool little kid, I might deny it. But we used to be good friends. Kaken got a quirk, and I didn't. It's an awesome quirk. Kakin knew it, and he knew everyone else knew it, and it might have got to his head a little bit. I think I started annoying him early on. I don't think Kakin wanted anything to do with a quirkless kid. He just personally didn't like me, and I wasn't able to fight back. I was an easy target, honestly. I'm not blaming him at all. He was just a little kid, we both were. Kids don't understand stuff like that. At least he's not telling me to jump off the roof anymore. Teachers can't do a lot, and I was fine. I didn't want to fit Kakin chances off getting into Watal. God fucking damn it, shut up. I still want to see how far he'll go. I mean, despite everything. Ugh. Screw that nerd. That stupid, freaking goddamn nerd. Why in the hell was Kakin feeling guilty? Was this what feeling guilty felt like? Insides all clenched up like they can't decide between completely smothering each other or heaving right out of his chest. Lungs restricted to the point he couldn't catch a satisfying breath to save his life. What was this shit? He didn't feel bad. This was Deku he was talking about. The most annoying crybaby weakling pushover he'd ever encountered in his entire life. He didn't give a shit about that stupid kid. That stupid kid who would never stop following him, and never stop looking up to him, and never stop seeing something different than what everyone else saw when they looked at him. What did that effing nerd see? Why did he have such a ridiculously high opinion of Bakugo? When and why in the hell had he developed such absurdly high regard for him? Is that what this was? Was Bakugo afraid, in some screwed up way? Afraid that shitty Deku's goddamn nonsensical admiration for him had set such a high and potentially unattainable standard for him to achieve? Is that why he hated Deku so badly? Was it all just another jacked up facet of his fear of failure? Bullshit. What the hell was he on about? It must have been late, because Bakugo clearly wasn't thinking straight. He hated Deku because Deku was Deku. Simple as that. Got him. Ugh. Regardless, why in the hell was he suddenly feeling some irrational sense of goddamn responsibility for the stupid nerd's whiny ass? This was all effing All Might's fault, wasn't it? I want to ask you to attempt to shoulder some of this burden with Midoriya. You're the only one capable of understanding what he's going through. Look after him, he can't always be there. Fucking All Might. Fuck him, too. This was all such a load of shit. All of it. Bakugo shoved it all away, as hard as he could. But remembering All Might's words only brought yet another irritating grievance to Bakugo's mind. Deku's mention of his bizarre encounter with Shigaraki at the mall a few weeks ago. What the hell had that been about? What could Shigaraki have possibly wanted to talk to Deku for? And why had Deku played it off like it wasn't that big of a deal? Did that idiot honestly not possess any sense of self-preservation? Did he even know what the term self-preservation meant? Clearly not. Looking back at his early days of struggling with his new quirk, how many bones had he broken by this point? Ugh, did the little effer not even realize his importance, now that All Might's legacy was riding squarely on his shoulders? Now that One for All's continued influence rested on him alone? How could he seriously not understand what a huge freaking deal that was? What an effing lucky honor that was. Had it never even crossed Deku's mind what would happen if Shigaraki took a personal interest in him? If Shigaraki picked up on even a hint of his connection to All Might? Did he have any idea what a potentially easily exploited weak point he could become to All Might? No, of course, he didn't. Because Deku was a freaking idiot. Ugh. Why was he still even thinking about any of this shit? Why was he worrying about any of it? It wasn't any of his goddamn business. It shouldn't have been even remotely close to being his business. Then why was it seeming more and more like his damn business every day? For God's sake. Bakugo rolled over with another angry sigh. He was done with this shit. Done thinking about it. Done trying to make sense of any of it. Done trying to figure out his own effing pointless feelings on the whole situation. They didn't matter. And neither did Deku, for that matter. None of it did. The only thing that mattered at the moment was getting enough rest to be able to hand Deku's infuriating, whiny ass to him on a platter in the morning. Then Bakugo would feel better. Then he could just forget the entire aggravating day, and how he, the smartest and most capable kid at UA, just hadn't been able to make heads or tails of any of it. Bakugo's alarm went off sooner than it should have. Sooner than it had any right to. With a groan, Bakugo sat up and reached to his limits to silence it. He kept his phone plugged in on his desk since it forced him to get up to shut it off. Not that he ever really had trouble with getting up, but if there was one morning he might have, it would have been that one. He'd slept like shit. He stretched slowly, stifling a yawn and glancing over to shitty Deku. His bed was empty. The sound of a running sink hummed from the bathroom. Bakugo blinked the rest of sleep from his eyes and pushed himself out of bed. He drew his shirt off with another stretch and turned for his dresser. Getting dressed in his workout gear saw him moving a little more slowly than he would have liked. He hoped it wasn't an indication of how his movements in training might hold up. He'd need to be quick. As quick as he was capable if he was going to square off with Deku. Deku emerged from the bathroom as Bakugo finished pulling his shoes on. "Hey," he said a little too friendly-like as he turned for the closet and grabbed a sweatshirt. "You getting ready?" he asked, pulling his hoodie on. No hint of any of yesterday's shit. No suggestion of their fight even happening. Bakugo was more than fine with that. Maybe the stupid nerd was finally learning. There was no point in rehashing crap that was in the past and didn't matter. "What's it look like?" Bakugo replied, annoyed at Deku's good mood. Straightening, he turned for the bathroom and brushed his teeth while Deku stretched or some shit. Bakugo spit, wiped his face, and entered the bedroom again, slinging his gym bag over his shoulder. "Let's go." Deku fell into step behind him, which, Bakugo noted, was smart of him to not try walking next to him. He wasn't about to stroll through the grounds side by side with that idiot. People might mistake them for buddies who train together regularly or some shit. Or even willingly. Freaking Aizawa. They made their way to one of the bigger gyms further away from their homeroom. A large portion of it was laid out similarly to how Cementos had set up their gym prior to their licensing exams when they'd been developing their special moves. Multiple platforms of varying heights created alleys on the ground, and diverse levels up above. Numerous hand and footholds covered the vertical sides of the tall platforms. It was a good setup for working with various quirks, especially if one wanted to involve height and incorporate their surroundings. They dropped their bags and took a minute or two to stretch. It was still very early, and Bakugo could feel his shitty sleep in his muscles and behind his eyes. "So," Deku said after a minute, a little apprehensively. "What should we start with?" Bakugo dropped his arm back down to his side, his shoulder still feeling a little tight. "Just some sparring, hand to hand. Get a feel for what shit you're falling short on." Deku released a short, uneasy breath. "K." He sounded hesitant. "Just as long as we don't end up going as hard as at ground beta. We won't have to if you're not a goddamn moron about it." "Right." The stupid nerd still sounded reluctant. "Look, just don't be an asshole, and no one will get hurt." Deku hummed a doubtful affirmative, and Bakugo took a stance. They went at it, carefully, somewhat hesitantly at first. Hand to hand, face to face. Bakugo always had to make the first move since Deku was a wuss, and he was mostly straightforward with it. It was usually his right hook. Occasionally, he'd switch it up to throw Deku off, or he'd lead off with a feint. But the result was always the same. A series of blocked blows on both sides, several fairly well-utilized openings, and eventually Deku winding up on the ground, panting, while Bakugo dug a knee into him. "Your reaction time is effing slow, Deku," Bakugo said, digging his knee into Deku a little harder than necessary as he made to stand. A faint wince crossed Deku's face. You're thinking too much trying to lay out the entire fight in your head before it's even begun. Bakugo rolled his head, stretching his neck. Why don't you just focus on the goddamn present and read your opponent's movements as they're happening, not what you think they'll lead to? It's making you slow as hell. Right, Deku said, staring up unmoving from the ground. Let's step it up. Use our quirks. You obviously need yours if you're going to keep up with me at all. Deku offered a cautious nod. He seemed nervous. Kagestim not gonna go at it like I did at ground beta. I know, you idiot. I'm not deaf. How many times do you think you need to repeat your annoying ass self? God. They brought their quirks into play, and their sparring match suddenly became interesting. Their hits became more interesting, having legitimate strength or explosive momentum behind them. Their blocks and evasive maneuvers became more interesting, their motions now capable of significant range. Their follow-throughs and recovery times were split-second fast. Deku was proving to be a challenge, just as much as at ground beta. It was actually almost exhilarating facing off with him again, without so much of the pent-up shit Bakugo had been dealing with at the time. Deku was fast. He was actually keeping Bakugo on his toes. Bakugo was still able to get more hits in, but Deku's dodges were coming across as almost effortless, and his recovery time was practically non-existent. Bakugo knew his poor sleep from the previous night was causing just a fraction of sluggishness on his part, and it was starting to get a little aggravating. They were using their surroundings to their full advantage now, propelling and rebounding as they attacked and dodged and chased each other up and around. The problem wasn't so much that Bakugo was just a hint slower than normal, which was frustrating as hell, to say the least. The problem was that Deku was a little too fast. He had gotten so fast. His dodges were well-timed and solidly executed, and he might as well have not needed even a split second for recovery, with how quickly he kept winding up back on the offensive. Bakugo was actually almost struggling against the stupid nerd, and it was starting to get infuriating as hell. He couldn't gain a solid upper hand, no matter what he tried. He'd get a momentary grip on Deku, blast him aside hard, and before he could get on him and make the pin, Deku would be gone back up and darting around for another offensive strike. Several minutes into their unrelenting skirmish, Deku came at Bakugo, aiming for a blow while seeming to know it wouldn't quite land. He gripped Bakugo, changing direction and rolling the momentum of his original hit to counter Bakugo's dodge as he whirled him about and flung him in the opposite direction. That was it. Bakugo had had enough. What the hell, Deku? Stop stealing my fucking moves. Bakugo fumed as he righted himself against a wall. He had pulled the exact same move on Deku at ground beta, when he'd flung him into the guardrail. Deku hadn't been quite as rough with it, but it was still his move. What? Think you can throw me off by getting a rise out of me? Bakugo demanded, running an arm across his mouth. No. If my moves seem similar, it's not intentional. They're just good moves, otherwise you wouldn't be using them, too, right? Deku responded, turning and kicking back and forth off parallel walls before propelling himself forward with his power, another technique Deku had stolen from Bakugo the week they'd returned from their internships. Stop trying to piss me off. Why the hell are you always trying to piss me off? Bakugo grabbed at Deku, a hand fisting in his shirt as the other drew back, ready to land a solid hit. Deku was strong though. He twisted in his grip and kicked off the wall again as Bakugo sent a furious explosion in his wake. I'm not, Deku exclaimed, quickly darting to the side before Bakugo could land on him. Bakugo redirected his course, trying to keep up with the shitty nerd. He was quickly losing what meager grasp he'd been trying to hold on his temper. Every single fucking thing you do is a jab at me, asshole. Don't think I don't notice, no matter how subtle a son of a bitch you pretend to be. Bakugo finally got a hand on Deku and was gripping him hard. They traded a few blows and blocks, each becoming more heated than the last. That's not true at all. Bakugo finally got a decent opening on Deku and swung at him hard, unable or unwilling to contain the burst that accompanied it. Deku twisted and leapt away, narrowly dodging. "Oh please, you got him, moron. How stupid do you think I am? Stealing my moves, never fighting back as kids, always sticking to your lame-ass high road." Bakugo barely avoided a well-aimed kick. He threw his hands out, using small bursts to quickly right himself before launching at Deku once more. They grappled with each other briefly again, neither able to gain the upper hand. "Following me all the way to Ua," Bakugo continued, his voice growing more livid. "Refusing to call me anything but my patronizing childhood nickname. Taking Deku as your hero name? Could there be a more blatant fuck you than that? Kaken, I." Bakugo finally landed a hit and Deku grunted, ducking his head a moment before locking gazes with Bakugo again, a new intensity flashing behind his eyes. "Don't even try to play dumb on that one, Deku. Do you think I'm fucking stupid? I can see right through you thinking you'll one day be number one, and that I won't ever be able to live your fucking name down. Fuck you. That's not even what are you even talking." More partially delivered blows on both sides as Bakugo gripped and shoved at him. "Wait. I take it back. It's not the name. The biggest fuck you you've ever thrown in my face is when you secretly gained All Might's favor behind my back. When you became his successor without telling anyone." Izuku quickly glanced around. "Keep it down, will you? And that's not your talking nonsense." "Shut up, Deku. Don't even try to deny what you meant by it all." "No, I won't shut up. And you're not. You couldn't be more wrong about any of that." Bakugo's grip on his temper had long since faltered. He was mad now. He was fucking furious. Furious that he hadn't been able to gain the upper hand over Deku when they'd been going at it for far too long now. Furious at Deku constantly one-upping him and sliding him and throwing out all his subtle fuck yous over the years that he wouldn't even own up to. Because he was above that shit, huh? Bullshit. That effing nerd was capable of playing just as maliciously as Bakugo. Only he had the effing audacity to deny it all by playing dumb. Yeah, Bakugo was mad. And he found a small trace of satisfaction upon glimpsing a fiery anger behind Deku's eyes as well. His insufferable, big eyes, staring back at him, incredulous. Yes, Bakugo wanted more of that anger shining in those stupid, green eyes. They sprang apart, breaths heaving, incensed gazes permanently locked in a too evenly matched war of wills. The anger was finally equal on both sides. For the first time Bakugo could ever recall. This was it. Deku was finally going to legitimately retaliate. He was finally going to reciprocate everything Bakugo had ever felt for him, all the hate, the disdain, the frustration, and most recently the envy. Deku was at long last understanding what that all felt like. And he was finally going to come at Bakugo with all he had. Bakugo could see it. Both boys stared at each other for another drawn-out moment before launching themselves at the other with a growl. Fists pulled back, one sparking with power, the other with fire. This was it. Deku's stupid green eyes, livid and resentful, were lining up just right in Bakugo's aim. "Give me everything you've got, Deku." Those stupid green eyes kept coming nearer, alight with indignation, exasperation, and yes, still anger. The fiery anger was still there. Bakugo smirked, ready to land his blow. And the fire went out. It was almost déjà vu. In the last split second, the flames were doused in those stupid green eyes, and there was nothing there but the most fleeting glimpse of remorse. Resignation? It all happened too quickly. Bakugo didn't have the chance to back down. His hit rang true, bolstered by as much explosive force as he could throw behind it. Deku hadn't hit back. He had chosen at the last moment not to hit back. And he hadn't had a chance to block either. He merely took the hit and went sailing through the air in seemingly slow motion before slamming into the wall behind him and crumpling in a heap at the bottom. Bakugo stared. He blinked. His chest heaved. What the hell just? Deku just continued to lay there, at the base of the wall, unmoving. Bakugo slowly righted himself, still trying to make sense of what had happened, why there was a limp and two still form across the way. He hadn't hit him that hard. He hadn't hit him that hard. He hadn't hit him that hard. Bakugo took what almost qualified as a step towards him. Deku? He took another uncertain step forward. Hey, asshole. A series of hesitant steps. Get up. The hell do you think you're doing? His chest felt tight as hell as he crouched next to Deku, a hand trying very hard to stay steady as he reached for a shoulder. Hey. He gave him a shake, trying to ignore the uninvited fear that had slipped in to join his uncertainty. He hadn't hit him that hard. He hadn't hit him that hard. Deku groaned, coughing weakly, and Bakugo might be lying if he claimed there was anything other than relief behind the sigh that just escaped him. Asshole, Bakugo said, his voice quickly regaining its usual vehemence as Deku gradually came to. What the fuck was that? Ooh, Deku's eyes blinked open, disoriented. What the hell did you think you were? Who the fuck are you, icy hot? Wha? Got him it. You got him, fucking idiot. You can't back out of a one-on-one exchange last second like that. You freaking son of a bitch asshole moron. Kakin? Deku was blinking up at him, attempting to sit up. Got him. What the hell is wrong with you? Deku's brow was furrowed in complete confusion. A wince pinched his brow further as he straightened against the wall. What's wrong? Bakugo just stared at him, teeth grinding and completely fuming before abruptly standing and stalking away. When he returned several moments later, Deku was still just sitting there, still just trying to make sense of his goddamn surroundings. Wha's that? Deku asked, his voice slurring as Bakugo pressed a towel against the side of his head. TSS ouch. You're bleeding, dumbass. Here. Bakugo gripped Deku's wrist, drawing it up to hold the towel in place. What happened? Deku was still so out of it. But Bakugo's exasperation wasn't about to lessen any. You just had to go and throw one more giant fuck you in my face, didn't you? Bakugo was shaking his head in disbelief. Because half and half pulling that shit on me once wasn't enough, was it? HM? Look, you goddamn idiot. You went and got yourself a fucking concussion because you're a stupid son of a bitch with no sense of self-preservation and absolutely no respect for your opponent in a fair fight. Got him. Fuck you, Deku. Deku only pulled the towel away to rub an arm across his brow. Don't, Bakugo huffed, redirecting the wadded towel back to the cut on the side of his head. He let out an annoyed sigh before grasping Deku's head, pulling it near to get a better look. Oh. Shut up. Satisfied, Bakugo released Deku, trying as hard as he could to be somewhat gentle about it. It's not that bad, so stop whining. It probably doesn't need stitches. Just keep the towel there till it stops bleeding. Bakugo stood, looking down at Deku in complete irritation. Can you get up, you idiot? Yeah, Deku replied, though he made no move to. Bakugo stalked away again, retrieving their bags. When he returned, Deku was still just sitting slumped against the wall, staring at the ground. Look, will you just get up? I can't just leave your stupid ass here, because you obviously have a concussion, and you need to go to the med bay. He gave Deku's shoe a light kick. Will you just stand up, asshole? Deku took a deep breath. Yeah, sure. It seemed to take him a fair amount of effort, and he was wincing all the way. But the stupid nerd managed to get to his feet. Bakugo studied him a brief moment before turning and leading the way out of there. They crossed through the school, Bakugo ignoring the wary gazes they drew. And when they finally reached a certain intersection of corridors, Bakugo called for Deku to stop. Where are you going? Deku shrugged. Dorms, he replied, as if the answer was obvious. No, you have to go to the med bay, you idiot. Bakugo said, pointing down the hall opposite the direction Deku was heading. Nah, I'm fine, Deku said, continuing on his way out of the school. Deku, Bakugo said, increasing his pace briefly to catch up. Don't be a jackass. Just go and let the old lady take a look at you. I'm good, don't worry about it, Deku replied, sounding a little huffy. You're practically bleeding out from an effing gash on the side of your effing head. You stupid idiot. Just stop, Deku retorted, sounding annoyed that Bakugo was hounding him. The stupid nerd was clearly very out of it. But whatever. Bakugo could hardly deal with a normal Deku, and he wasn't about to bend over backwards for a goddamn concussed Deku full of sass. Fine, whatever. Effing moron, Bakugo muttered. They made their way back to the dorms, walking a length apart from each other. They would have gone their separate ways if they weren't headed for the same destination. Luckily, most of the extras were still out training or home for the weekend, so the common area was pretty easy to slip through mostly unnoticed. Bakugo took the stairs a little behind Deku and rounded the second floor, heading for their room. He entered the room shortly after Deku, and was a little surprised to find the nerd had already holed himself up in the bathroom, without even first attempting to address the shitshow that had been their training session. Bakugo tossed the gym bags down. It kind of seemed like concussed shitty Deku didn't care to talk, and Bakugo was just fine with that. Bakugo plopped down at his desk. He supposed he could get going on some of his studies while waiting to shower. Man, Deku was such a moron. What in the hell was that? Bakugo wasn't about to feel bad for inadvertently injuring the stupid nerd. What the hell did the idiot think would happen if he pulled a move like that? God, he was so stupid. The sound of retching from the bathroom suddenly interrupted his thoughts, and Bakugo's insides tightened a fraction. He stopped tapping his pencil against his book and paused, listening. More retching. The flush of a toilet. Damn that idiot. He needed to go see the old lady. Bakugo tried to drag his attention back to his schoolwork in front of him, but it proved difficult when all he could find himself doing was listening for more signs of distress from shitty concussed Deku in the bathroom. It was quiet. It sounded like the nerd was at least done puking. Petit didn't sound like he was doing much of anything else either. Several minutes passed with nothing but silence on the other side of the bathroom door. What was he doing? Had he passed out or some shit? Ugh, was the freaking idiot dying in there or what? He wasn't about to check on him. What the hell? The idiot could drown in his own vomit for all Bakugo cared. But the endless silence on the other side of the door was starting to eat away at him for some unknown reason. Got him it. Bakugo waited another long moment before finally drawing to his feet. He stalked over to the bathroom, knocking at the door and not bothering at all to be polite about it. What the hell are you doing in there, Deku? I need to shower, damn it. No answer. Bakugo's breath paused. Deku, he called. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, ignoring the slight relief he felt upon finding it unlocked. What the hell? Bakugo asked upon finding Deku draped over the toilet bowl. Apparently he'd been asleep or some shit, more likely passed out or something. But he actually squinted open his eyes and raised his head a fraction as Bakugo entered. Why didn't you answer me, asshole? Bakugo demanded. I think I'm sick. I don't feel good. Oh my god, you idiot. How many times do I have to tell you you have an effing concuss ion? Bakugo replied, emphasizing the word with as much exasperation as he could. Get off your goddamn ass and go see the old lady right now. You're pale as shit, and I heard you puking. Deku slowly buried his head back in his arms for a moment before somehow managing to push himself to his feet. I'm just tired, and I don't feel too great, he said, mildly brushing past Bakugo and heading towards his bed. He eased himself down on it and sank face first into his pillow. Bakugo followed him with his eyes and huffed. His daily annoyance allotment already exceeded. Why the hell will you not just go get your damn head taken care of? I'm fine. Will you stop saying that, shithead? I just heard you puking your guts out. And now you're practically passing out all over the place. Look, you probably shouldn't go to sleep without getting it checked out first, you idiot. Justice HHH. Did that effer just shush him? Fine. Whatever. Screw you, moron. Bakugo threw his drawers open and grabbed some clean clothes. And he wasn't too quiet about closing the bathroom door behind him as he went to shower. What an effing idiot. Deku was still asleep when Bakugo emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later. And when Bakugo returned from sneaking a meal in the cafeteria, another 45 minutes after that, Deku was still soundly asleep. It was between hour 3 and 4 of his homework that Bakugo felt the faint gnaw of worry creep back in. Gah, it was annoying as hell. Why in the hell should he be worried about that stupid nerd's stupid head? The whole thing was essentially an accident. It wasn't his fault Deku had wussed out and taken the hit. It's not like Bakugo had attacked him with the aim to harm him. And it wasn't like Bakugo was at risk of being expelled over it. That was, if Deku wasn't actually dying. Ugh. Bakugo pushed his books away and stood. The stupid nerd had been sleeping for over 4 hours. That was more than long enough. Deku. No response. Just continued light breathing. He roughly shook his shoulder. Deku, it's time to get your lazy ass up, asshole. A mild adjustment against the pillow was all Bakugo got in response. Deku, he shook him harder. Wake up, you goddamn idiot. A small shrug of annoyance. TCH. Fine. Stupid son of a bitch. Go ahead and sleep till you die then. See if I care. Bakugo sat back down at his desk with a huff. He was done with his studies for now. He couldn't sit there staring at his books anymore. His brain needed a rest. But he couldn't exactly take off and leave the shitty concussed nerd alone, could he? And where would he go that wouldn't draw questions? He was certain at least one of the extras had likely noticed Deku dripping blood on their way in from training. It was a wonder the whole thing hadn't spread through the entire class and had them all clawing at the door already. Bakugo released another exasperated sigh, unsure of what to do. He glanced at his phone. Asking for help was probably the last thing he would normally do, but maybe he could just turn the shitty nerd over to someone else and be done with the mess. He reached for his phone. Bakugo, shitty hair. Shitty hair. Yo. Shitty hair. What's up? Bakugo, come by my room. Bakugo, shitty Deku's room, I mean. Shitty hair. Maybe in like an hour? Pretty busy with HW. Bakugo, just come now. Shitty hair. What's up? Bakugo. The stupid nerd hit his head during training, and he's been sleeping all goddamn day and won't wake up. Shitty hair. WTH. Shitty hair. What? Shitty hair. Is he okay? Bakugo, I don't know. I'm not a fucking doctor. Shitty hair. Be right there. A knock sounded at the door, less than 2 minutes later. Bakugo stood to answer it, and immediately fumed upon drawing it open. What the hell? Why is he here? Bakugo demanded, locking eyes with Icy Hot, standing next to Kirishima. Half and Half just quietly brushed past him, heading over to Deku's bed. I figured you wouldn't want the guys tagging along with me, but I bumped into Todoroki in the elevator, Kirishima explained, stepping inside. And, I don't know, he just seemed like he'd be more useful than you or me in this situation. Bakugo let a low growl escape him, but didn't say anything more about it. He turned as Kirishima hesitantly approached the bed as well. Icy Hot was alternating between tapping Deku's cheek and shaking his shoulder. Midoriya, Icy Hot said, shaking a little harder, yet somehow managing to still be gentle about it. Can you get up? He's been a goddamn lazy idiot all day, and he refused to go to the med bay earlier. Half and Half glanced up briefly with what Bakugo assumed was an accusing glare. It was difficult to tell with that asshole sometimes though. He silently fumed. Why the hell had Kirishima brought that bastard with him? What happened? Kirishima asked, crossing his arms as he took another uncertain step towards the bed. Bakugo released a short breath. We were training together this morning, since Aizawa's an idiot for making us, and the stupid nerd pulled some half-and-half shit on me and backed out of a hard exchange. Icy hot-eyed him again. Look, I didn't mean to hit him that hard, asshole. Deku's just a wuss, and it was an accident. Half-and-half was attempting to draw Deku up to a sitting position. Kirishima reached down to help. Deku's stupid eyes were finally starting to blink open as half-and-half drew one of his arms over his shoulders. Can you stand? Icy Hot asked him. We need to take you to recovery, girl. Kirishima bent to reach for Deku's other arm and slung it over his own shoulders as Icy Hot made to stand with him. Deku's eyes were finally mostly open. I'm fine, he mumbled, attempting to shrug them off, but they held his arms in place. Yeah, we know. It's okay. We're just gonna help you part of the way, all right? Till you wake up a little. Kirishima said, his usual light-hearted tone back. They walked Deku to the door, and Icy Hot's gaze found Bakugo's once more. The bastard was being difficult to read on purpose. It made Bakugo seethe. Why the hell should that bastard care about shitty Deku so much? It's not like he had any history with a stupid nerd. He didn't have any claim to friendship with the idiot. Why the hell should he have any right to look at Bakugo like he'd just kicked a goddamn puppy or some shit? Bakugo glared back and slammed the door behind them. Good effing riddance. Bakugo let out a thoroughly irritated sigh. What a shitty morning. What a shitty goddamn week. All because of shitty Deku. At least the stupid idiot was off his hands for now though. At least he wasn't going to slip into an effing coma and die in his effing sleep because Bakugo hadn't said or done anything. That at least counted for something, right? Bakugo huffed again, deciding he was more than done with the day. And it was still too early for that. Ugh. He dropped on his bed, finally giving his fatigue a chance to make itself fully known. The morning had been a suckfest, and he could really use a nap. When Bakugo woke hours later, he was still alone in the room, which was just fine by him. He pulled out his phone and watched some pointless shit online for a bit, and then snuck out for a few laps around campus, followed by a meal in the main building's cafeteria. He'd been hoping to avoid as many shitty extras as he could, since he was certain they all would have heard how he'd busted shitty Deku's head open that morning, and he had no intention of dealing with their indignant glares all evening. He stopped by the library briefly in search of a couple books to clarify some questions he'd had on his studies earlier, and finally decided to head back to their dorm room. It was getting near enough to what could be considered an early bedtime. Finally, he was so done with the day. He showered a second time from his earlier run, and took his time with it. The hot water felt nice, and he didn't have much else to do, really. When he emerged from the bathroom, a good 30+ minutes later, Deku was back. He was standing at his dresser, a drawer open. Bakugo noticed a lone little bottle of pills sitting on the nerd's desk. Their eyes met briefly. Hey, Deku said, glancing back to his sock drawer. He scratched the back of his head. Sorry about earlier, he offered somewhat quietly. Yeah, that was really fucking stupid of you. Bakugo ran his towel through his hair again. How's your head? Deku closed his drawer, clean clothes in hand. It's fine, he offered. I mean, it aches. But Recovery Girl did what she could and gave me some pills, he said, gesturing vaguely. Bakugo didn't respond, just made his way to his desk, while Deku took his turn in the bathroom. The shower ran for a long time. Bakugo idly flipped through one of his new books, wishing Deku would hurry the hell up so they could go to bed already. It was still fairly early, but he was pretty sure Deku was as anxious to be done with the shitty day as he was. Deku finally emerged, stopping at his desk briefly to take some of his medicine, and climbed right into bed. Bakugo was a little surprised, but he figured the shitty nerd must have really needed the rest. He watched him for a brief moment before flipping his lamp off and climbing into bed as well. He lay there for a long time, waiting for the shitty nerd to speak. He was going to any minute now. There was no getting around it. He was sure stupid Deku was just dying to talk through their latest daily shitshow. The shitty nerd stayed surprisingly quiet, however. Bakugo could tell he wasn't asleep, though. He was still moving too much, and his breathing was too quiet. Finally, fed up with Deku's exasperating silence, Bakugo let out an annoyed huff. "Why did you do that earlier? Why did you take that hit?" he demanded. Deku took a long moment to respond. His voice was still a little more subdued than normal. "I was getting too mad," he finally said, though it wasn't much of an explanation. "So?" Bakugo demanded again. "What, were you afraid of hitting me back? Worried you might actually hurt me or some shit?" he scoffed. "Fuck you, Deku." "No," Deku replied, once again taking his time. "I just didn't want to win like you." "What the hell does that mean?" "I don't know. You always win out of anger. Every time. You just get so angry. Like you lose control or something. I was doing the same thing. Or about to, at least. Andy didn't want to win like that like you." "What the fuck are you talking about, you idiot? Get the hell out of here with that shit. There's nothing wrong with tapping into anger for a win, you effing moron. You should try it sometime, you goddamn wuss. What the hell's your problem?" Deku just sighed, and Bakugo fumed a little further. "Well, guess what, you idiot," Bakugo added a moment later. "All Might said you're going to have to take a page from my book if you're seriously aiming for the #1 spot. Weren't you listening to anything he said at Ground Beta, asshole? You can't just be a weakling pushover all the time. You have to want to win. And actually effing try. Got him. You and Icy Hot and your got him. Stupid ass superiority complexes." Deku was silent again a moment. "Do you really think I can do it?" he asked quietly. "Become #1. "What?" Bakugo scoffed. "No. Not if I have any goddamn thing to say about it. You think I'm just gonna back down and hand you the spot? Think again, asshole." "Beautif, I do become #1, Deku continued, sounding even slower and duller than usual. "What will that mean for you? Will my plants will who I have to become ruin everything for you? Your goals and dreams?" Bakugo blinked and stayed quiet a moment. "Look, shitty Deku. You're clearly loopy as shit right now from whatever the hell the old lady gave you. Just stop talking. Go to sleep." None of that was true, by the way. Huh. All that talk of me throwing fuck yous in your face. That wasn't true. At all. Any of it. I can't believe you'd think that. Yeah, you're definitely out of it if you're throwing out the F-bomb tonight. Just go to sleep already. Cacking night. Bakugo released a short breath through his nose. Stupid nerd. He rolled over, actually pleased to find sleep claim him much sooner than expected. Izuku woke the next day feeling fairly well rested and more back to normal than he expected. His head still ached, but not bad enough to warrant missing class over. Although Recovery Girl did forbid him from training that morning, which sucked to miss out on, but he figured he wouldn't be too productive anyway, with the mild dizziness that still lingered. He popped a few ibuprofen, deciding he wasn't in enough pain to risk the drowsiness that accompanied Recovery Girl's pain pills. It would be pointless to attend class all loopy and unable to focus. He and Kaken didn't speak much in the brief moments they passed each other while getting ready that morning. But Izuku could feel Kaken's eyes linger on him just a little longer than normal. And not exactly in his usual seething manner, either. It was more as if he was wanting to get a read on how Deku was feeling without having to stoop to actually asking him. Izuku knew Kaken would never intentionally show outright worry over him. But through his hazy memories of the previous day's events, Kaken had almost seemed uncharacteristically concerned over the hit Izuku had taken. And maybe that was because he was initially afraid he may have accidentally killed Izuku and was at risk of being expelled. But Izuku thought there might have been a little more to it than that. The way Kaken had torn Izuku a new one for backing out and taking that hit, yeah. It could have merely been wounded pride speaking, but it almost seemed as if there was fear behind Kaken's angry words. Fear that he had actually seriously injured Izuku. Sure, Kaken had beat up on Izuku countless times in the past, but never with the aim of legitimately hurting him. Never anywhere close to the point of causing a concussion. Granted, Kaken hadn't exactly been nice in his unwilling show of concern, but his frightened yelling, his insistence on Izuku going to the med bay, his checking up on Izuku after his bouts of vomiting, it all almost seemed as if Kaken might have cared a little bit, or at least felt a small trace of remorse for delivering such a hard blow. And maybe it was silly of Izuku to find surprise in the fact that Kaken didn't actually want to kill him, or even hurt him to the point of needing medical attention. Like, of course Kaken didn't really want that, right? Why should Izuku find that so surprising? Kaken was still human, despite his uncanny abilities and unfailingly heated temperament. He was seeing more and more snippets of Kaken's hidden humanity every day. And besides, there was a whole world of difference between disliking someone and wanting them dead. After all, hadn't Kaken already admitted the other night he never actually meant his suggestion to Izuku of offing himself? Of course, Kaken still hadn't apologized for his hurtful words, or come anywhere near an apology, really. But still, it was all a pretty far cry from Bakugo's usual outright hostility and indifference Izuku had grown so accustomed to. It made Izuku actually feel almost kind of glad, reflecting on all that. Happy, in a small way. Like achieving the impossible might not actually be as hopeless as it initially appeared. It almost felt like maybe, perhaps, dare Izuku say he'd made a snippet of progress. Maybe Izuku was going to go ahead and call it progress. Kaken didn't actually want him dead, and he'd seen convincing evidence with his own eyes. Confirmed fact. Progress. Okay, well, that was all well and good. But Kaken regretting hurting him definitely wasn't the most disconcerting aspect of their sparring match the previous day. No, it was the argument that had led up to it. What on earth had Kaken been going on about? Claiming literally everything Izuku did was a dig against him. What? Did he seriously? How could he honestly? Where the heck had he come up with such nonsense? Who in their right mind could honestly misinterpret any of Izuku's actions as being even remotely similar to Kaken's? As being even on the same hemisphere of the earth as Kaken's? As being even on the same plane of reality as Kaken's? Stealing his moves, not deeming Kaken worthy of his retaliation as kids, patronizing him by continuing to call him Kaken after all these years, choosing Kaken's personal insult for him as his hero name, being acknowledged by All Might and secretly chosen to be his successor. How could Kaken honestly think any of that was in any way directed at him, was in any way meant to be hurtful towards him? How could he really think that? How long had he thought that? Did he even know Izuku at all? They'd been part of each other's lives for as long as they both could remember. Had Izuku inadvertently done something to sway Kaken's completely misguided thinking? Had he unknowingly slighted Kaken that bad in the past? He had only ever tried to be nice to Kaken, despite the constant bullying and rejection of his friendship. He couldn't recall a single instance of Kaken justifiably misjudging his actions as malicious. And that's simply because no instances like that existed. Izuku had only ever been tolerant of Kaken. He'd only ever been kind and supportive. How could Kaken really have misread everything to the point of complete distortion? Honestly, it really bothered Izuku. If he was being completely honest. And it kind of shed new light on Kaken's unfailing hostility toward him through the years. Izuku always thought that it was just how Kaken was. That he shouldn't take his animosity so personally because he hadn't done anything. and Kaken was just impossible and mean without cause. But that wasn't the case in Kaken's eyes. To Kaken, all his actions had been provoked, justified. Because according to him, Izuku had been playing right alongside him all these years, subtly and slyly plotting how he could even the score time and again. It was ridiculous. How could someone as smart and perceptive as Kaken be so far off base in his observations and judgments? Kaken was normally so good at reading people. Why was Izuku such a blind spot for him? Was Kaken merely in denial? Could that be it? Instead of accepting Izuku's well-meaning intentions and disinterest in retaliation, because it made absolutely no sense to him, perhaps Kaken found it easier to simply twist it all into something seemingly malicious. Or maybe he just really wasn't capable of comprehending a mindset so different from his. And because of his inability to understand, all he could do was continue looking at things and interpreting them through his own competitive, vindictive lens. Either way, it was extremely perplexing and bothersome. Izuku couldn't help throwing sidelong glances Kaken's way all throughout class. He wanted to talk to him, or at least grab him by his infuriatingly stubborn blonde head and shake all those crazy, baseless accusations right out of him. Shake him till he could see just how wrong he was. But he knew he couldn't do that. Kaken would blow him away on the spot for one thing, and for another, everything needed to be approached with such caution when Kaken was involved. All he could do for now was hope Kaken really had believed him the previous night when he'd been out of it on pain meds. When he'd stressed how untrue all of Kaken's claims were, he'd try to broach the subject again in the near future. He'd try to make sure Kaken really understood Izuku's true intentions behind his actions, that they were never meant to be hurtful to his childhood friend. That it had honestly never even occurred to him that they might be. Anything and everything he'd ever done was only in the hopes of pursuing his dreams to become a hero. And to be kind and helpful to everyone around him, Kaken included in the meantime. Regardless though, it was actually good all of that had been brought up. It was good it was out in the open now. It gave him such a better understanding of Kaken than he'd ever had before. And hopefully Kaken was starting to understand him a little better now, too. The rest of the day passed without incident, and both boys seemed content to gloss over the previous day's events for the meantime. The following day saw the boys behaving rather civilly as well, mostly due to the lack of communication between them. Neither of them were sure what terms they really stood on with each other currently, and Izuku was too timid to bring it up. But the unspoken almost truce between them had been a nice change of pace for once, and he wasn't keen on ruining it. He didn't know how long Kaken would continue to feel bad about the whole concussion thing, but he was fine with taking advantage of the lessened animosity for now. It was sometime after dinner later that evening that Izuku found himself in the boys' bath area. The kids had had a fairly rigorous round of capture the flag during class earlier, and combined with the soreness Izuku still felt from Kaken's blow on Sunday, he was more than anxious for a long soak. And it felt nice. Quite nice, in fact. He was surprised he didn't take advantage of the spa more often. And he was also surprised he was the only one in there at the moment. But he supposed it was kind of an odd time to be using it. Most of his classmates were either still eating or doing homework. Which, speaking of, Izuku had better get going on his own soon as well. It was too tempting to spend the rest of the evening doing nothing in there, and he didn't really have the time for that. Oh yeah, that was why he didn't use the spa too often, because it inevitably ended up feeling like wasted time. He finally drew himself from the water, his muscles feeling quite a bit looser, and pulled his clothes on in the locker area. It was as he was about to emerge into the common area that he heard raised voices nearby. Well, he heard a raised voice, and he didn't need more than one guess as to who it might have belonged to. He paused at the doorway a moment, listening, wondering what had set Kaken off. The hell do you even know his mom's name, anyway? I dunno. Internet sleuthing. Zeros, like, freakishly good at crap like that. That was Kaminari. Izuku peeked around the doorframe. They were gathered at the main couch, Shiro at the center, while Kaminari, Kirishima, and several other classmates huddled fairly close nearby. Kaken stood behind the couch, glaring down over Shiro's shoulder. "That's not creepy at all," Kaken spat. "What the hell are you even looking for?" "I figured if I could find just one picture of the two of them, or just one article that might mention her, that would be proof enough." "Of what?" "Midoriya's relation to All Might." "Duh," Kaminari offered. Kaken's voice took on an irate edge Izuku hadn't heard in a few days. "You're not seriously still going on about that, are you?" "Well, didn't you see him during that last round of CTF earlier?" Shiro explained a little hastily. "He managed to capture Ida, rescue Tsu, Gyro and Koda, grab the flag and get it back to base, all while somehow managing to dodge both Todoroki and Takoyami at the same time. His speed's gotten pretty insane. And that kind of speed combined with the super strength behind his quirky dono, it's just a little too reminiscent of All Might's." It took Kaken a moment to reply, which was never a good sign. "I thought I told you assholes to cut it out with the All Might comparisons." There was a rage behind those words. He was clearly fighting to keep at bay. Kaminari scoffed. "Just because you hate the idea so bad, I can practically see smoke coming out of your ears, doesn't mean it might not be true." "Shut the hell up, Sparky." Kaken's grip on his restrained rage was obviously quickly slipping. "What the fuck is wrong with you assholes? Did you ever think to try asking him?" "Got him. What the hell do you think you're doing sneaking around behind his back, looking for pictures of his goddamn mom on the goddamn internet? Deku's never been a shady son of a bitch, unlike you assholes, so why don't you just try asking him yourself, for fuck's sake?" He paused a moment, taking a heated breath. "Seriously, people think I'm the tactless asshole of the class, but look at you douchebags poking around in Deku's business when you don't know shit about his situation with his real dad." Kaken seemed at a loss for further words after all that. He heaved another furious breath before immediately turning on his heel and stalking away. Izuku dropped back behind the doorway, wanting to avoid being seen. The others were silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Dang," Shiro finally said, sounding contrite. "I never thought I'd see the day we'd be rightfully scolded by Bakugo." "Yeah, no kidding," Kirishima agreed after another long moment. "He's right. It is a really bogus move of us to be looking into all this crap behind Midoriya's back. He's our friend. We should be able to either ask him outright or just drop it." "Yeah," Kaminari agreed. "I'd totally ask him to his face. Beauty actually don't know anything about his situation with his dad." "Me neither," Kirishima replied, his voice regretful. "It never even occurred to me that the All Might comparison rumors might actually be a little hurtful for Midoriya." "Yeah dang," Shiro said remorsefully. "Time to let the rumors rest, I think." Izuku hung back another long while before showing his face in the common area. He really didn't want anyone feeling further embarrassed or ashamed because of him, and he planned to play it all off, as if he hadn't heard anything at all. He wasn't offended by their snooping, really. It was only natural to see the similarities between his and All Might's quirk and to wonder. But Kaken, his objection to their friend's queries had been another undeniable example of his unusual, hidden decency. He had actually stood up for Izuku. Izuku would hardly have believed it if he hadn't just seen it with his own eyes. Kaken was keeping his promise to All Might and him. He was really going to help keep their secret under tight wraps, even if it meant going out of his way to berate his friends. Izuku felt a flush of gratitude warm his insides. He never would have expected a showing of outright almost kindness from Kaken on his behalf. It was the most foreign feeling ever, and honestly, Izuku couldn't help feeling a little touched. He knew he shouldn't, really. Kaken hadn't known Izuku had overheard him, and he knew he'd have been furious if he caught him listening. But even Soit was the nicest thing Kaken had ever said about him, even if it was behind his back. and Izuku wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. Of course, he couldn't point it out or bring it up to Kaken. That would be a big mistake. It was like he had reasoned the other day. If Kaken was going to offer rare moments of almost niceness, Izuku was going to continue being extremely careful with how he responded. He couldn't outright thank him. That would backfire, no doubt. But he could try to show his gratitude in other ways. He could try to make their forced time together more tolerable for Kaken. In small ways. He knew Kaken hated it when he talked too much. He couldn't stand it when he mumbled. He hated when Izuku moved around too much at bedtime, or when he left dirty socks on the bathroom floor, or let his study area overflow with untidiness. Right then, Izuku would start paying better attention to all the little things along those lines. He'd try his hardest not to annoy Kaken as much. It was a pretty weak form of a thank you, but it was at least something. It was at least some small way for Izuku to show his gratitude. And it actually seemed to go quite well at first. Izuku avoided speaking unless Kaken addressed him first. He paid extra special attention to his muttering tendencies during class and study time. He kept his bed, desk, and the bathroom impeccably tidy. He didn't sit too close to Kaken at lunch, and he didn't ever bother him about appeasing Aizawa or Ada. And they had several more days of incident-free, civil coexisting. It was nice, in a way. Falling into a fairly stable routine free of the usual clashes and outbursts. Granted, they weren't talking much with Izuku's new resolve of leaving it up to Kaken to initiate conversation. But at least they weren't fighting. Kaken at first seemed not to notice Izuku's new efforts, or not to care. But as the week passed, Izuku once again felt Kaken's eyes linger longer on him as he straightened his desk or flipped off his lamp without comment for the night. It was another couple evenings later, towards the end of the weekend, that Izuku turned away from his dresser and accidentally collided with Kaken emerging from the bathroom. Kaken grunted in annoyance as he stepped back, letting Izuku pass, and waiting for an apology. Izuku didn't offer one, however. He knew it would only annoy Kaken further, so he chose to merely brush past him, heading to his desk. Kaken huffed as his eyes followed Izuku across the room. TCH, what the hell's your problem? Why have you been acting like such a little bitch lately? Izuku paused, turning to glance at him. Huh? Normally you can't shut your damn mouth to save your life. But you haven't said shit to me all week. Oh, what? Are you still pissed about Sunday? That was your own effing fault, you know. If you weren't such a dumbass wuss, it wouldn't have happened. It's not like I meant to give you an effing concussion, you moron. Izuku's brows pinched slightly. Had his recent quiet demeanor been misinterpreted as silent treatment? Was this a weak attempt at something close to an apology? Don't get me wrong. The only time you're even remotely close to tolerable is when your trap's kept shut. But this whole silent treatment thing is bullshit, and annoying as hell. What are you, 12? Huh? Kaken was growing more irritated. Got him. Are you deaf or just that effing slow? Just answer my goddamn question. What the hell put you in such a bitchy mood this week? I didn't do shit to you. Izuku was growing more confused by the minute. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh my freaking god. You're seriously going to resort to the whole playing dumb shit again? Do you think I'm that stupid? God, you are the most annoying fuck ever. Do you know that? Kaken fumed as he turned for his dresser. Izuku's eyes followed him, all creased with bewilderment. Kaken, what are you talking about? Izuku demanded. The only reason I've been less talkative the last few days is because I know you prefer it when I'm quieter. Eh? I was trying to be nice, you know? Considerate. Maybe make this whole crappy situation a little more bearable for you. Kaken just stared at him with narrow eyes. Bullshit. Why in the hell would you randomly decide to be nice to me? Kaken, when have I ever been anything but nice to you? Shut up, asshole. I was just trying to pay attention to the stuff, I do that really annoys you, Izuku explained. And you know, maybe do less of it. Kaken's eyes narrowed further with suspicion. Why? Just to repay you for. Izuku immediately trailed off, having momentarily forgotten his resolve not to mention what he'd overheard in the common room. Huh? Just because. Repay me for what? Kaken demanded. Izuku let out a resigned sigh. Here we go again. I overheard you in the common room the other day, he explained, his voice all hesitation. I didn't mean to, he quickly added. But I heard you telling the guys off for wondering about my relation to All Might. Izuku winced slightly as he raised his eyes to meet Kaken's. Kaken's face pinched with a look of disgust. You were eavesdropping? He demanded, his breathing quickly picking up. Izuku sighed again and attempted to stifle a slight eye roll. He really didn't want to get into it that night. They'd been on a fairly impressive confrontation-free streak lately. He didn't want to ruin it. Don't roll your eyes at me, shithead. Why were you eavesdropping? I didn't mean to, Kaken, Izuku explained, trying not to sound as exasperated as he felt. I was just trying to get back to our room, but I didn't want to embarrass everyone by showing up in the middle of that conversation. Kaken only glared at him, his shoulders heaving. Look, I'm sorry I overheard words that weren't meant for me, Izuku explained, hoping he could smooth the situation over before it had a chance to escalate. I know crap like that is always a bogus move to pull, and I really didn't mean to. But regardless. Izuku dropped his gaze, knowing he was about to enter the danger zone. I was grateful. He took another resigned breath. Grateful for your help with my situation with All Might, and grateful that you stuck up for my parents. Kaken's breathing continued heavily for another long moment as he kept staring. You effing asshole, he finally spat. You think I said any of that shit for you? You think I was defending you, you stupid son of a bitch? Another defeated sigh. No, Izuku offered, turning towards his bed. I don't really care why you said it, it doesn't matter. I was still grateful. He climbed in bed, turning away from Kaken. I just wanted to show my thanks by trying not to bug you so much this week, that's all. He could still hear Kaken's fuming breaths across the room. He seemed to be fumbling for words. A long pause passed before Kaken finally settled on throwing out a fuck you, Deku, for lack of anything else to say. Izuku just ignored him, pulling his pillow closer. God, you're such an effing. Kaken was still struggling with his words, incredulous as he was. Fuck. Just cut it out with the silent shit, will you? It's only pissing me off more. You're always telling me to shut up. And then when I actually do, it only ends up annoying you more. That makes zero sense. Because now I know you're only doing it to try and get on my good side, shithead. So, knock it off. I don't have one, and if I did, there's not a chance in hell you'd ever find yourself on it. Izuku sighed. Kaken crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping Izuku's shoulder and pulling him around to look at him. Do you want to die, fucktard? What the hell is your problem? Izuku didn't falter. Kaken, I'm clearly not the one with the problem right now. He couldn't keep his voice from rising. You need to learn to just accept people doing something nice for you for once, and not make it into some huge issue. It's really not that big of a deal. It doesn't mean you're weak, and it doesn't mean you'll ever owe me anything. Okay, just let it go. He jerked his shoulder free not too harshly, and turned back away. Kaken only stood there staring, muttering expletives under his breath for a long moment before finally managing to tear himself away and stomp off to bed. Once again, the following day, the boys chose to ignore their latest confrontation and pretend it hadn't happened. It was easier that way, being forced to live together. Being forced to share space and meet each other's eyes multiple times throughout the day, wondering what was going on in the other's head. They fell back into a routine of tentative civility, tolerating each other for the most part, and not whining about their situation. Izuku had given up his resolve of silence, still hardly believing how bothersome it had been to Kaken. He really would never have guessed it would end up having the opposite effect he intended it to. He still attempted consideration upon choosing when to speak, and he was still very careful with his mumbling habits when he happened to slip up in class or while studying. However, Kaken didn't grip his arm like a vice anymore. He merely tapped Izuku with the back of his hand, neither looking up from his notes or saying anything. They still attempted training together, but Ida and Todoroki had forbidden them from sparring. They could work in the same vicinity, and perhaps swap comments or observations on moves, but any type of competing with each other wasn't allowed. Too risky. Too potentially disastrous. It was another several days later that Izuku awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of the window closing. His eyes blinked open, the darkness offering no explanation for his waking. "Kaken?" he asked dully at the rustle of blankets, as Kaken seemingly climbed back in bed. "SHH. Was wrong?" Izuku asked, his sleep-addled brain filled with fog. "Nothing. Shut up. Go back to sleep." "K." Izuku turned back to his pillow with a yawn. A drawn-out moment stretched for a long while, Izuku not really sure whether sleep had claimed him again or not, when another sound drew him back to the darkness of the room. He wasn't certain what it was at first. A series of faint clicking of some sort, quietly stopping and starting up again at even intervals. He listened curiously for a long time before it finally dawned on him through his clouded thoughts. "Kaken, are you cold?" he asked, a hint of concern lining his voice. "No. Shut up," Kaken replied through shivers, his voice unusually thick, even for it being the middle of the night. "Are you sick?" Izuku asked, drawing up a fraction as he turned further towards the bed across the room. "No. Stop talking." "Got him." More poorly stifled shivers. "How did you get sick?" Izuku wondered aloud, dropping slowly back to his pillow while still listening closely to the shivering boy nearby. "Ugh," Kaken huffed, choosing to ignore him as he turned away. It sounded like it took effort. Izuku let a silence fall between them again, but Kaken's shivering was unrelenting, despite his obvious efforts at holding it back. It was difficult to fall asleep to. Not just because the chattering of Kaken's teeth was loud and distracting, but also because Izuku couldn't help feeling concerned over it. How had Kaken gotten sick? They had class in the morning, and he knew Kaken would have to be nothing short of lying on his deathbed before he'd willingly opt to miss class. They lay unmoving for a long time, the silence continually interrupted by Kaken's shivering starting up again and again. Finally, frustrated with not being able to fall back asleep and feeling sympathetic for Kaken's miserable situation, Izuku abruptly pushed his covers aside and stood, heading for the closet. He reached for the top shelf, grabbing a spare blanket and turning for Kaken's bed. He quietly draped the blanket over Kaken's curled up, trembling form, wishing he was asleep and wouldn't notice, but knowing he wasn't. He was grateful when Kaken didn't say anything and didn't refuse the blanket. He obviously needed it, and Izuku was worried his pride might have prevented him from accepting it. He was glad Kaken chose to feign sleep. That way he could pretend he'd been completely unaware in the morning. Izuku knew it was always easier that way for Kaken. The morning came quickly and unwelcome, and Izuku was prompt to wake and silence his alarm, despite not wanting to get up anytime soon at all. He'd slept poorly, and being awoken for an hour or so around 2:30 certainly hadn't helped anything. He glanced over at Kaken, still curled up under the extra blanket, the subtle rise and fall of his breathing steady. Izuku wondered when the shivering had finally let up. He vaguely wondered if Kaken was running a fever. He undoubtedly had been during the night, what with the case of chills he'd been dealing with. But Izuku wondered if it had carried over to the morning. He approached Kaken's bed, peering